Hey, welcome back. I am really glad you decided to spend tonight with me wherever you happen to be tucking yourself in from. Get settled, pull that blanket up a little higher, let your shoulders drop away from your ears just for a while, because tonight we're not going to a castle or a battlefield or some lost city buried under sand. Tonight we're going somewhere much closer than that. We're going inside your own body. Somewhere inside you right now there is a story that almost did not survive. A story about two different kinds of human standing close enough to touch on a night neither of them could have understood the weight of. That story left its mark on nearly every part of your genetic code, on every part except one single chromosome that for over 20 years seemed to quietly refuse to remember any of it at all. And tonight we go looking for why. But before we slip into that story together, can I ask you a quick favour? If the quiet kind of true story, the kind that helps your mind finally unwind at the end of a long day, is the reason you keep coming back here at night, take one small second right now to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It costs you nothing. And honestly, it means everything to a small corner of the internet like this one. And if you have a moment to spare, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I read every single one and I like knowing who else is out there in the dark with me. All right, let us dim the lights a little more. Maybe turn on a fan, not because it is warm, just because that soft hum somehow makes a story feel twice as good. I do not make the rules, I just follow them. Get as comfortable as you're ever going to get tonight, and let us begin. Picture a valley. It does not have a name yet because names like that will not exist for tens of thousands of years. Somewhere along the narrow strip of land bridging Africa to the rest of the world, the sky is turning the colour of a dying fire, deep orange fading into something closer to bruised purple. The air smells like dust and dry grass and something colder underneath it drifting down from the mountains once the sun disappears. A young woman crouches near a stream filling a skin with water. She's what we would later call Homo sapiens, though. Of course, she's never heard that word and never will. Her people came from the south, following herds, following rivers, following any thin thread of hope that led somewhere with more food and fewer hungry nights. She carries the kind of tiredness that settles into your bones after weeks of walking, the kind that lives behind your eyes even when you're sitting still. And she is careful tonight, more careful than usual, because for 3 evenings now her people have not been alone in this valley. There is smoke rising from another fire further up the slope. It has been there every night this week, steady, unhurried, never once flickering out before morning. Her people noticed it first as a smell carried on the evening breeze, and then as a soft orange smudge against the darkening hillside. Whoever builds that fire builds it differently than her own family does. Larger, heavier, stacked with a kind of confidence that unsettles her a little every time she looks up and sees it. Their footprints near the water are wider than any she has known. Their stride, judging by the distance between each print, is longer too. Somebody or something out there is simply bigger than anyone she has grown up around. They are what we would later call Neanderthal, though tonight here no one has invented that word yet either. To her they are simply the other people. The ones who were already living in this valley long before her family arrived, hunting this same stretch of land, drinking from this same stream, burying their own dead somewhere among these same hills, for longer than anyone in her family has ever counted. She does not know that far behind her, across an ocean of grassland and forest, she will never cross again her kind split away from his kind, roughly 600,000 years earlier. She does not know his people have already outlasted colder winters than hers has ever faced, that they have cared for their sick and their injured well enough that some of them lived on for years, afterward unable to hunt properly, unable to walk without help, kept alive for one reason only, because someone somewhere among them decided they were still worth keeping. She knows none of this. She only knows what her own eyes are telling her right now, which is that a man is standing at the edge of the tree line close enough that she can see his breath curling in the cold evening air, and he is looking directly at her. Her first instinct is to run. It always has been every time she's caught sight of them this week, a glimpse through the trees, a shadow moving along the ridge at dusk. But something about tonight is different. Maybe it is simply exhaustion. Maybe it is the particular stillness of the way he is standing patient rather than threatening the way you might stand if you had decided quietly to let someone come to their own conclusion about you in their own time. Or maybe after 3 nights of watching that same fire flicker steadily up the slope, some small curious part of her has simply grown tired of being afraid of a shape in the dark. This is the part no one alive today can tell you with certainty, because we do not have their names. We never will. No fossil, no fragment of bone, no scrap of stone tool comes stamped with a story this specific. But we do have something almost stranger than a name. We have proof that something very much like this happened. Maybe not in this exact valley on this exact evening, but somewhere very much like it again and again across thousands of years, in places we will never once be able to circle on a map. He does not come any closer. She does not run. Not right away, though every instinct in her body is telling her she should. For a long moment they simply stay exactly where they are, 2 entirely different kinds of human close enough to hear each other breathing over the sound of the stream, each one quietly trying to decide what the other one actually is. Then slowly, almost carefully, he lowers himself down near the water too. Not beside her, not yet. Just close enough that they now share the same narrow stretch of stream between them. He sets something down on a flat stone. Meat freshly caught, still warm enough that she can see faint steam rising off it in the cold air. He does not speak because there is no shared word yet between their 2 kinds of people, nothing either of them could offer the other except this. He simply leaves it there on the stone, straightens up and steps back into the dark, letting the distance between them stretch out again, unhurried, patient, the way you might give a wild animal room to decide for itself whether to trust you. It is such a small thing. A little food offered by a stranger across a divide that by every reasonable measure should have been far too wide to ever cross. And yet moments exactly like this, one quiet and unremarkable, never written down anywhere, because no one yet knew how to write, are the very moments that eventually built you. Not as some poetic figure of speech, literally. Somewhere inside the story your own body is still quietly telling. Tonight there is an evening almost exactly like this one. We like to imagine history as armies and kings and burning cities, because those are the stories that got written down first. But most of what actually shaped us happened in rooms this small, this quiet. A hand offering food to a stranger. 2 people deciding over the course of one long evening not to be afraid of each other anymore. It would happen again and again in other valleys, other winters, other centuries across tens of thousands of years, until eventually, without either side ever fully realizing it, they had quietly rewritten what it meant to be human at all. Picture it happening once more a few years later, somewhere further north where the ground stays frozen longer into spring. A different woman, a different fire, a different flat stone with something warm resting on top of it. And again further north still where the nights stretch long and the stars feel close enough to touch. Different faces every time, different valleys, different rivers with different names no one would ever get the chance to write down. But underneath all of it, the same quiet decision, made over and over by people who never knew each other, who never knew they were part of the same slow, scattered story at all. That is how history actually tends to move most of the time. Not in one dramatic moment, but in hundreds of small, unremarkable ones echoing each other across centuries without anybody ever planning it that way. Now let us leave that valley behind for a little while and travel a very long way forward, past every war and empire and invention you have ever learned about in school, to a small, cold research lab more than 50,000 years later, a place lit by the flat hum of fluorescent light, instead of firelight, filled with the low, steady drone of machines, instead of a breeze moving through dry grass. Late one night, long after everyone else has gone home, a researcher sits alone at a desk, scrolling slowly through endless columns of genetic data pulled from thousands of living people. Ordinary people from Europe, from Asia, people who once rolled up a sleeve or spat into a small plastic tube without ever imagining what that tiny sample might eventually reveal about a valley none of them had ever heard of. And there, glowing on the screen in front of them, something strange keeps happening. Almost every single chromosome in the human body carries at least a small trace of that ancient meeting. Tiny fragments passed quietly down generation after generation after generation, so faint and so scattered that nobody even noticed they were there until modern science finally learned how to look closely enough to see them. Except for one, a single chromosome, the X chromosome that looks almost swept clean, almost deliberately empty, as though something at some point had reached in and gently, carefully erased it. The researcher leans back in the chair, rubs their eyes, and looks again, half expecting the pattern to disappear the second time around. It does not disappear. The gap is real. It holds steady, sample after sample, population after population, an entire chromosome that seems to be quietly refusing to remember a meeting that shaped nearly everything else about who we are. Outside the window, the city has gone mostly dark. Somewhere out there, in ordinary houses, ordinary people are falling asleep, carrying a piece of that valley inside them without ever knowing it in almost every part of their body, except this one small, silent gap that has been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to finally notice it and ask why. For more than 20 years, that one small, strange, empty space would become one of the most argued over mysteries in modern genetics. Scientists would spend entire careers trying to explain it. Some of their answers would sound almost certain, confident enough to end up in textbooks, right up until newer evidence quietly pulled the ground out from under them, and the whole question had to be asked again from the beginning. And to understand any of it, we first have to go back to that valley one more time and ask a much simpler question than anyone expected, one that turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this story. Who exactly were these two kinds of people, the woman by the stream and the man at the edge of the trees, and just how different or how strangely alike did they truly turn out to be? Now, back in that valley, I mentioned something almost in passing. I said his people had cared for their sick and their injured well enough that some of them lived on for years afterward, unable to hunt, unable to walk, without help, kept alive for one simple reason, because someone among them had decided they were still worth keeping. I did not add that detail to make the story sound prettier than it was. That is one of the most carefully documented and, honestly, one of the most moving discoveries in everything we know about Neanderthals. And I think it deserves a proper look because it tells you almost everything about who these people actually were long before anyone bothered to ask. In the 1950s, in a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, a team of archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who'd been given the nickname Nandy. He had died somewhere between the ages of 30 and 50, which for his time was already old. But it was the state of his body that stopped everyone in their tracks. At some point in his life, he had taken a serious blow to the side of his face, leaving him blind or very close to it in one eye. His right arm had been broken so badly it eventually had to be lost below the elbow. His leg was deformed in a way that would have given him a painful limp for the rest of his life. And later studies of the tiny bones in his ears showed that on top of everything else, he had gone almost completely deaf. Sit with that for a second. A blind man missing most of one arm, unable to walk properly, unable to hear a predator approaching from behind him, somewhere in an Ice Age landscape full of cave lions and hyenas. By any reasonable measure, a man like that should not have lasted another season. Instead, he lived for years, which means quite simply that other people fed him when he could not hunt. Other people walked slowly enough for him to keep up. Other people in a world with no medicine as we understand it decided that his life still mattered enough to be worth the trouble. I want to be fair with you here, though, because part of writing about the past honestly means admitting when we do not know something for certain. There is a famous claim tied to another skeleton at that same cave, one buried alongside clusters of ancient pollen which some researchers in the 1960s argued meant Neanderthals had laid flowers over their dead. It is a beautiful image, and for decades it shaped how we picture them. But more recent analysis has raised real doubts about it, suggesting the pollen might simply have blown in, or been carried there by burrowing rodents rather than placed there by grieving hands. I bring that up not to take anything away from the story, but because I think you deserve a narrator who tells you when the evidence is solid, like it is with Nandy, and when it is still honestly up for debate, like it is with the flowers. Here is a question worth sitting with while we are on the subject. If you found out right now that a group of people living tens of thousands of years before writing existed had built an entire social contract around protecting their most vulnerable member, would you still be comfortable calling them primitive? Because caregiving was not the only thing they were quietly capable of. In a rock shelter in Croatia called Krapina, buried in a single layer of soil, archaeologists found 8 talons from white-tailed eagles, along with a bone from one of the bird's toes, all showing the same kind of cut marks and polish you would expect from something worn-handled and strung together over and over. The talons came from at least 3 different eagles caught separately, kept and carried. Researchers who studied them concluded they had almost certainly been assembled into jewellery, a necklace or a bracelet, something meant to be looked at and worn, not eaten or used as a tool. Here is the detail that matters most. Those talons are roughly 130,000 years old. Homo sapiens would not set foot in that part of Europe for another 80,000 years. So whatever instinct led a Neanderthal to hunt down one of the fastest, most dangerous birds in the sky, just to wear its claws around their neck, that instinct was entirely their own. Nobody taught them that. Nobody showed them how. For a very long time, scientists assumed that kind of symbolic thinking, the very human urge to decorate yourself with something powerful and beautiful, belonged to us alone. The eagle talons of Krapini quietly proved otherwise more than a century after they were first dug out of the ground and left sitting unexamined in a museum drawer. And it was not only ornaments. Long before anyone was pouring concrete or mixing epoxy, Neanderthals were making their own glue. Across sites in what is now Germany and Italy, archaeologists have found small lumps of dark, sticky tar produced by slowly heating birch bark until it breaks down into a usable adhesive, then used to fix a sharpened stone point onto a wooden handle. For years, researchers argued this proved Neanderthals could plan ahead and control fire with real precision, since early experiments suggested the process only worked within a narrow band of temperature. More recent attempts by archaeologists in the Netherlands have actually shown simpler methods can work too, using nothing but bark embers and a flat stone, which is a good reminder that science keeps correcting itself the more closely we look. Either way, someone still had to notice that heated bark turns sticky, remember it, and deliberately recreate it on purpose, again and again, purely to solve the very practical problem of a spearhead that kept falling off its handle. So let's talk about the brain that was doing all of this thinking, because this is where the story gets almost embarrassing for our species in the best possible way. If you could very carefully scoop out an average adult Neanderthal brain and pour it into a measuring cup, the kind you would use for baking, you would need close to 6 full cups to hold it all. An average modern human brain, by comparison, fills a little under 5.5. Neanderthals were on the whole walking around with more brain matter than we were, and had been for a very long time before we ever met them in that valley. Before you go feeling insecure on behalf of your own species, though, there is more nuance here, and I think the nuance is actually the interesting part. Quick question for you, since we are already talking about it. If bigger really always meant smarter, wouldn't the largest-brained creature on this entire planet, the sperm whale, be running things by now, instead of us? Obviously, it does not work that simply, and Neanderthals are a perfect example of why. Researchers at Oxford spent years comparing the skulls of Neanderthals and early modern humans from the same time period, and they noticed something curious. Neanderthal eye sockets were noticeably larger than ours, which suggests larger eyes, and larger eyes usually mean more brain tissue devoted purely to processing what you see. Their theory is that Neanderthals adapted to the darker, cloudier skies of high-latitude Europe, needed extra visual processing power just to get by. Which is a perfectly reasonable use of a large brain. It is just not the same as extra room for the kind of complex large-scale social networking that some scientists believe helped our own ancestors survive in bigger, more cooperative groups. A bigger brain, in other words, does not automatically mean a smarter one. It means a brain built for a particular life in a particular world, and that world was not always the same as ours. Their bodies told a similar story of specialization rather than inferiority. Neanderthals tended to be shorter and considerably more powerfully built than the humans arriving from Africa, with wider rib cages built for greater lung capacity, and shorter forearms and shins that held onto body heat far more efficiently in the cold. It is in a strange way the exact same principle behind why you would rather stay wrapped in a thick sweater during winter than dressed for the beach. Evolution had spent hundreds of thousands of years tailoring them a built-in winter coat. Meanwhile, the newcomers were still dressed biologically speaking for African summer. So if they were this capable, this resourceful, this quietly sophisticated, where on earth did the image come from, the one most of us grew up with, of the dumb, hunched, grunting caveman? I can actually answer that one, precisely because it comes down to one man, one skeleton, and one very unfortunate mistake. In 1911, a French scientist named Marcelin Boule was handed the most complete Neanderthal skeleton found up to that point, an elderly individual discovered in a French cave the locals called La Chapelle aux Saints. Boule spent years carefully studying those bones, and then published his official reconstruction of what a living Neanderthal would have looked like. His version stood with a hunched back, bent knees, a jutting forward head and feet that splayed outward almost like an ape's. That single reconstruction became the template. It shaped textbook drawings, museum displays, and popular imagination for the better part of half a century. There was just one problem, and it is almost funny in hindsight if it were not for the century of damage it caused. That particular skeleton belonged to a man who had lived a long life, with severe arthritis in his spine, hips, and jaw. When scientists finally re-examined those same bones decades later, using better tools and a great deal less bias, they realized Boule had not reconstructed a typical Neanderthal at all. He had accidentally reconstructed one elderly arthritic individual and then presented that person's stooped, aching posture as a defining trait of an entire species. It is a little like judging how all humans walk based solely on the gait of your one grandfather with the worst hip in the family. An honest mistake perhaps made by a serious scientist doing his best with the tools of his time, but it quietly convinced the world for generations that Neanderthals were something less than fully human, and that single flawed drawing ended up in more textbooks than almost any other image in the history of anthropology. While all of this was happening on their side of the story, our own ancestors were having their own quiet revolution, one most people never learn about in school. For a long time, scientists believed Homo sapiens appeared in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, and spread outward from there a tidy single origin story that fit neatly into a textbook paragraph. Then, in a collapsed mining cave called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, researchers who had first started digging there decades earlier finally got permission to reopen the site properly. What they found was startling. Skulls, jawbones, and stone tools belonging to people with faces that already looked remarkably like ours, modern around the eyes and jaw, though still slightly heavier, browed and longer skulled than we are today. When the bones were finally dated using more advanced methods, the results pushed the known origin of our species back by an entire 100,000 years, all the way to roughly 300,000 years ago. That single discovery suggested we did not emerge from one single spot in East Africa at all, but took shape more slowly across a much wider stretch of the continent in small, scattered populations that were only loosely connected to each other, occasionally meeting, mixing and drifting apart again for tens of thousands of years before any of them ever thought about leaving Africa at all. Which means both sides of that meeting in the valley were far stranger and more complicated than the simple story we like to tell. Neither one of them was the finished, polished version of a human being. Both were still very much works in progress, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of separate trial and error, arriving at that riverbank as two different, imperfect, remarkably resourceful answers to the same basic question every living thing eventually has to answer. How do you survive? I will be honest with you, the more time I have spent with this part of the story, the harder it has become for me to think of Neanderthals as some lesser failed branch on our family tree. They cared for their disabled. They wore jewellery they clearly did not need to wear. They engineered their own adhesive out of tree bark centuries before anyone thought to write the word chemistry. They built a life sturdy enough to survive winters that would likely kill most of us within a week. If anything, the deeper you look, the more the line between them and us starts to blur in a way that feels less like a hierarchy and more like a mirror. I think that is honestly the part people find hardest to sit with. Not that Neanderthals were less than human, but that they might have simply been human in a slightly different key, playing the same song, we were just with a different set of instruments. Which brings us to the real question hanging over everything we've talked about so far. If both of these people were this capable, this human, in every sense that actually matters, then how, and more importantly, where did their paths actually come to cross? Because that meeting was never going to happen by accident in just any patch of land on the planet. It happened in one very specific corner of the world, shaped by ice, by drought, and by the kind of slow, restless human migration that had been building toward that exact moment for tens of thousands of years. And once you see the map, the way geologists and archaeologists have slowly pieced it back together, you start to realize that valley I described earlier was not some random guess dressed up as history. It sat almost exactly where the evidence says it had to. So let's actually answer that question, because the location was not chosen by accident, and neither was the timing. If you pull up a map of the ancient world and start looking for the one place on Earth where a person could walk out of Africa without getting into a boat, there is really only one door. A narrow strip of land threading between the Mediterranean coast and the edge of the desert, roughly where Israel, Jordan and Lebanon sit today. Geographers call it the Levant. For most of human history, if you wanted to leave Africa on foot, this was the only hallway available to you. Every single person whose ancestry traces outside the African continent, everyone in Europe, everyone in Asia, everyone whose great-grandparents crossed an ocean to reach the Americas has a family tree that funnels back through this one narrow stretch of coastline, whether they have ever heard of it or not. Except the hallway did not stay open all the time. This is the part most people never learn, and honestly, I think it is one of the most beautiful details in the entire story. The desert on either side of that corridor, the Sinai, the Negev, was not always desert. Earth wobbles slightly on its axis in a cycle that repeats roughly every 20,000 years, and that wobble is enough to shift the monsoon rains further north for a while, turning what is now cracked empty sand into something closer to grassland dotted with lakes and slow-moving rivers. Think of it a little like a curtain being pulled back on a stage, then quietly drawn shut again. Only the stage is an entire desert, and the show only runs for a few thousand years at a time before the curtain falls. Climate scientists studying ancient cave deposits and seabed sediment have mapped these wet phases out across the last 125,000 years, and what they found was not one single grand exodus, but a series of open windows pulses really opening and closing every few tens of thousands of years, like a door being propped ajar and then quietly swinging shut again. Here is a question worth turning over in your mind for a second. What do you imagine it must have felt like living on the edge of a desert that occasionally, without warning, over the course of a single generation turned green? Every time that corridor opened, something moved through it. Herds first, then whatever was hungry enough or curious enough to follow them. And somewhere inside those slow migrations again and again came small groups of people. Not one heroic journey out of Africa, the version most of us were taught in school, but many separate attempts spread across tens of thousands of years, most of which we will never even find evidence for. Now walk with me to Mount Carmel on the coast of what is now northern Israel, because this is where the story gets almost impossible to believe if you did not already know it was true. Scattered along this single limestone ridge sit several caves close enough that you could walk between most of them in an afternoon. One is called Tabun. Another, barely a short walk away, is called Skul. Not far off are Kibara, Amud and Kafze, and in every single one of them archaeologists have found human remains. Here is where it gets strange. The remains in some of these caves belong to Neanderthals. The remains in others belong to early Homo sapiens, and the dates painstakingly worked out over decades using thermoluminescence and electron spin resonance, the kind of dating methods that measure how long minerals have sat quietly absorbing background radiation, show that both kinds of people were using this same short stretch of coastline on and off for tens of thousands of years. Not necessarily at the exact same moment in every case. Sometimes Neanderthals for a while, then modern humans moving back in decades or centuries later. Then Neanderthals again, like two different families, unknowingly leasing the same apartment across the generations, never quite overlapping enough to leave a note. But the window during which both groups were active in this same small stretch of coastline appears to stretch across tens of thousands of years, and researchers examining the region only within the last couple of years have argued the overlap was likely closer, messier and more direct than anyone assumed even a decade ago. At Kibara, excavators found something that still gives me chills every time I think about it. A small, delicate bone from a Neanderthal throat called the hyoid. It is the bone that anchors your tongue and voice box, the bone that in you right now is quietly making it possible for the words in your own head to become sound. The Kibara hyoid is shaped almost exactly like ours. That does not prove Neanderthals were sitting around telling each other stories the way I am telling you one right now, and scientists are still careful about overstating what one small bone can tell us. But it strongly suggests they had the physical hardware for complex speech, which is a very different creature than the grunting silhouette most of us grew up picturing. And this is not old news being quietly recycled for the sake of a good story. Only recently, researchers working at another cave along that same ridge, a site called Tinchame, uncovered burials showing careful use of ochre pigment and grave goods, the kind of deliberate symbolic treatment of the dead once thought to belong only to modern humans. One of the researchers involved a paleoanthropologist at London's Natural History Museum, who has studied this region for decades, has said publicly that the evidence for overlap between the two populations in this exact area, around 100,000 years ago, is stronger than anyone previously assumed, and that the potential for both cultural and biological exchange between them was clearly there. In other words, the picture keeps getting more crowded and more intimate the closer scientists look, not less. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the earliest modern humans to reach that Israeli coastline, the people buried at Skul and Kafze, arrived far earlier than you might expect. Not 50 or 60,000 years ago. Somewhere closer to 100,000 years ago, possibly even further back than that. Which means our species tried to leave Africa successfully physically, at least once tens of thousands of years before the version of the story most documentaries tell you about. And there is a quietly humbling part to all of this. As far as the genetic evidence available to us today can tell that early population did not go on to become the ancestors of anyone alive now. They pushed out into a new world, built lives there, buried their dead with what looks like real ceremony and care, some of the oldest deliberate burials found anywhere on the planet, and then generations later simply did not continue. A door opened, a group of hopeful, resourceful people walked through it, lived there for what may have been thousands of years, and their particular branch of the family tree appears to have quietly ended anyway, swallowed up by drought, disease, competition, or simply the slow, ordinary math of small populations that never fully recovers from a bad decade. We do not get to know their names, we barely get to know they existed at all. And only because a handful of their bones happen to end up in exactly the right cave, it would take another wave one that many researchers place closer to 70 or 60,000 years ago before a group finally pushed out of Africa and kept going, spreading into Asia, into Europe, eventually into places their Skul and Kafze predecessors never got close to. Every single person listening to this tonight whose ancestry traces outside Africa descends from that later luckier wave. Not the first attempt, the one that happened to work. But here is the detail I think gets lost the most in the popular version of this story. The meeting between our two kinds of people did not end the moment modern humans finally pushed past the Levant. It kept happening over and over for tens of thousands of years as both groups spread deeper into unfamiliar land. Let me show you exactly how far that trail runs, because the evidence gets almost uncomfortably personal. In a cave in the Balkan mountains of Bulgaria called Bachokiro, researchers examining some of the oldest confirmed modern human remains anywhere in Europe, people who lived roughly 45,000 years ago, found something remarkable buried inside their genetic code. Long, unbroken stretches of Neanderthal ancestry, the kind of stretches that only stay intact for a handful of generations before ordinary genetic shuffling breaks them apart. Based on the length of those stretches, these particular people had a Neanderthal ancestor only about 5 to 7 generations back in their own family tree. Not some distant, half-mythical relative from deep prehistory. A great-great-great-grandparent. Someone whose face a grandmother in that cave might plausibly have remembered. And Bachokiro was not even alone in this. Around the same span of centuries, several hundred miles further west in a cave near Prague in the Czech Republic, a skull that had actually been sitting quietly in a museum collection since the 1950s, largely forgotten, was finally given the genetic analysis it deserved. It belonged to a woman, and once researchers reconstructed her full genome, she turned out to be, by a fairly comfortable margin, the oldest fully sequenced modern human found anywhere in the world. She carried Neanderthal ancestry to roughly the same amount most Europeans and Asians carry today, but her particular family line, like the Skull and Kafse pioneers before her, simply did not continue. She belonged to one more branch that reached out into a new continent, lived a full and probably difficult life there, and then, for reasons we may never fully know, quietly ended. Whole populations, not just individuals, kept vanishing from the family tree this way, again and again, leaving only bones and occasionally, if we're lucky, a genome as proof they were ever here at all. And then further west in the Carpathian Mountains of what is now Romania, in a cave called Peștera cu Oase, researchers found the jawbone of a man who lived somewhere between 37 and 42,000 years ago. When they finally managed to pull usable genetic material out of that jaw, the results were startling, even to the scientists running the analysis. Somewhere between 6 and 9% of his entire genome came from Neanderthals, by far the highest percentage ever found in a modern human before or since. The segments were so long and so intact that researchers could calculate almost exactly how recent that ancestry was. 4 to 6 generations. This man, whoever he was, whatever his life actually looked like, almost certainly had a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent, or possibly a great-grandparent. Somebody in his own living memory, or at least in stories he would have grown up hearing around a fire, might have actually known that person. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think it changes the emotional shape of this whole story. This was not one isolated symbolic meeting between two lonely strangers at the edge of a valley the way I described it earlier tonight. That kind of moment almost certainly happened more than once, but it was only ever the opening scene. What the genetic record actually shows is something closer to an ongoing overlapping relationship between two peoples, stretching across a corridor in the Middle East, and then following the slow spread of humanity all the way into the heart of Europe, repeating itself in different valleys, different centuries, different families for tens of thousands of years, right up until the very last Neanderthals disappeared. And notice something else while we're here. Almost none of these people knew each other's names or shared a common language or had any concept of the words Neanderthal or Homo sapiens at all. They were simply neighbours. Sometimes rivals, occasionally something closer than that, doing what neighbours separated by a thin, permeable border have always eventually done throughout the entire history of our species. Slowly, unevenly, and usually without meaning to, they became part of each other's story. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of these encounters simply never left a trace at all, buried under thousands of feet of soil in caves nobody has excavated yet, or in bones that never fossilized in the first place, or in coastal settlements that drowned beneath rising seas thousands of years ago and will likely never be found by anyone. What we actually have, Shanida Krapina, Tabun, Skul, Tinchemet, Bachokiro, Zlati Kunoase, is not the whole story. It is only the small fraction of it that happened to survive the erosion of 100,000 years, get buried in exactly the right kind of stone, and eventually land in front of someone with a trowel and enough curiosity to keep digging. Which raises an obvious question, one I think deserves its own honest answer before we go any further into this story. How did anyone even manage to decode genetic material that old in the first place? Bones that have been sitting in the ground since before the last ice age fully ended are not exactly known for keeping their secrets intact. Most of the deoxyribonucleic acid inside them has broken down into fragments, barely a few dozen letters long, chewed apart by time bacteria and tens of thousands of years of groundwater seeping quietly through limestone. getting a usable, reliable answer out of material that fragile took decades of failed attempts, ruined samples, entire careers spent chasing a result that kept slipping away, and one particular scientist who refused to give up on a question almost everyone else in his field had quietly decided was impossible to answer. His name was Svante Pääbo, and to understand why he was the one who finally cracked this open, you almost have to go back to something a little embarrassing. He did as a graduate student years before anyone had heard of him. In the early 1980s, Pääbo was supposed to be studying immunology at a university in Sweden, working toward a fairly conventional doctorate, the kind of steady, respectable career path his professors expected of him. But he had a private obsession he was not telling his supervisor about. As a teenager, he had fallen in love with ancient Egypt, the sort of quiet, private fascination a lot of us had as children, and most of us eventually grew out of. Pääbo never quite did. He wanted to know if it was possible to pull genetic material out of something that had been dead for thousands of years, specifically an Egyptian mummy. So at night, after his actual research was finished for the day, and everyone else had gone home, he would sneak back into the lab and run his own secret experiments, essentially moonlighting on a completely different scientific career, while everyone around him assumed he was simply working late on his real doctorate. At one point, curious whether the mummification process itself might help preserve genetic material, he bought a piece of liver from a grocery store and baked it in a laboratory oven, trying to recreate as closely as he could manage the exact drying conditions the ancient Egyptians used on human bodies. If you're picturing a slightly ridiculous scene right now, a young scientist hunched over a smoking piece of supermarket liver at midnight, hoping nobody walks in and asks what on earth he is doing, you are picturing it correctly. Somehow it worked, or at least it appeared to. Pääbo eventually got permission to test real mummified tissue, and in 1985 he published a paper claiming he had successfully extracted and copied genetic material from a 2,400-year-old Egyptian child. It caused a sensation. He received a letter from a well-known evolutionary biologist in America named Alan Wilson, so impressed by the result that Wilson assumed Pääbo must already be a professor and asked if he could come spend a year working in his laboratory. Pääbo was not a professor. He had not even finished his doctorate yet. Here is the part almost nobody tells you when they tell this story, and I think it is the most important part of all. That famous result, the one that launched his entire career, was wrong. As Pääbo continued working with old genetic material over the following years, he slowly came to understand something the entire field had not yet grasped, that ancient tissue is spectacularly easy to contaminate and spectacularly hard to protect from it. A single fleck of modern skin, a stray breath, even bacteria naturally living inside the bone itself, can completely overwhelm the tiny fragile traces of anything actually old. When he went back and looked honestly at his own famous mummy result, he realized the fragments he'd proudly reported in 1985 did not behave the way 2,400-year-old material should behave at all. They were too long, too clean, too intact. What he had actually amplified in all likelihood was contamination from his own everyday immunology experiments sitting in the very same lab. Try to sit with that for a second. The discovery that made his name the one that got him a personal letter from one of the most respected scientists in his field was very possibly nothing more than an accident involving his own skin cells. I imagine most people, faced with that realization, quietly changing research topics and hoping nobody brought it up again. And to be fair to him, he was hardly alone. The field he had wandered into during the 1980s was at the time something close to a circus. Other laboratories were publishing papers claiming to have recovered genetic material from insects trapped in amber millions of years old, and even briefly and famously from what some researchers insisted might be dinosaur bone. Every one of those claims eventually collapsed under closer scrutiny, torn apart by exactly the same problem Perbo had just quietly discovered in his own work, modern contamination masquerading as ancient discovery. For a while, ancient genetics looked less like a science, and more like a cautionary tale, the kind of field serious researchers avoided putting their name near if they wanted to keep their reputation intact. Perbo did the opposite. If contamination was the problem, he decided then contamination itself would become his life's work. He took the postdoctoral position with Alan Wilson at Berkeley anyway, and instead of chasing another flashy result, he spent years building the unglamorous foundations. Almost nobody gets credit for sterile laboratory protocols, strict physical separation between ancient and modern samples, an almost paranoid assumption that every single result was contaminated until proven otherwise. He pushed for a standard that sounds almost obvious now, but was not standard practice at the time, that any truly ancient result had to be independently reproduced in a completely separate laboratory before anyone was allowed to believe it. It was slow, thankless, deeply unfashionable work. Nobody hands out prizes for building better contamination controls, but it is also quite literally the reason any of tonight's story is possible to tell at all. By 1997, Perbo had built his own institute in Leipzig, Germany, specifically to chase the kind of ancient genetic questions most scientists considered a waste of time. He filled it with people who shared his particular flavour of stubbornness: chemists, computer scientists, archaeologists, all working under one roof around a question. Most of academia still quietly considered a dead end, and there he set his sights on the most ambitious target imaginable: an entire Neanderthal genome, not just a few scattered fragments, but the whole thing letter by letter. Here is roughly what that actually meant in practice. His team worked primarily with 3 bones pulled from Vindiga Cave in Croatia, tens of thousands of years old, carried into a laboratory, built almost like an operating theatre, positive air pressure, keeping outside air from ever drifting in every surface, periodically bathed in ultraviolet light strong enough to shred any stray strand of modern genetic material sitting on a countertop. Anyone entering had to change out of their street clothes entirely, pull on a full protective suit, a mask, a hairnet, sometimes a face shield before they were even allowed near the bone itself. Every one of those precautions existed for one single reason: to keep a researcher's own skin breath or hair from doing to this project exactly what Perbo's own contamination had done to his mummy result 3 decades earlier. And once inside that sealed, sterile room, the bones were ground down into fine powder, and when the team first analysed what was actually inside that powder, the results were almost comic in how discouraging they were. Less than 6% of the genetic material recovered from the bone belonged to the Neanderthal at all. The overwhelming majority, something close to 90%, came from bacteria that had spent tens of thousands of years quietly colonizing the inside of that bone after its owner died. Imagine being handed a haystack, being told your one needle is somewhere inside it, and then being told that 90% of the hay is also somehow a different, less interesting kind of needle you have to sort out first. His team eventually found a workaround, treating their samples with enzymes that selectively broke down and filtered out that bacterial material, which meaningfully increased how much usable Neanderthal genetic code they were left working with. It was not elegant, it was not fast. But piece by piece, letter by letter, across years of failed attempts, it worked. In May of 2010, Perbo's team finally published a draft of the complete Neanderthal genome. And when they laid that genome directly beside the genetic code of people living today, comparing millions of tiny individual letters across both looking specifically at which rare mutations modern populations happen to share with the Neanderthal genome. More often than pure chance could reasonably explain the result, confirmed for the first time with hard genetic proof, rather than speculation, exactly what we've spent the last little while talking about tonight. Neanderthals and modern humans had in fact interbred. It was no longer a theory built entirely on suggestive bones and a handful of unusually mixed skeletons. It was written directly into the genetic code of millions of people walking around today, most of whom had never given Neanderthals a single thought in their entire lives, sitting quietly in their own cells the whole time, waiting for someone to finally build a tool sensitive enough to notice it. When the paper finally went public, it did not stay contained inside scientific journals for long. Newspapers around the world ran headlines telling ordinary readers, many of them for the very first time, that they were quite possibly carrying pieces of an extinct human species inside their own bodies. It was the kind of finding that managed to be rigorous enough for a leading academic journal, and strange enough to make dinner-table conversation on the same afternoon, which does not happen often in genetics. Somewhere in that wave of coverage, a fact that had lived quietly inside specialist debate for decades finally became something millions of ordinary people were hearing about for the first time, sitting at their own kitchen tables wondering, however jokingly, whether they might be a little bit Neanderthal themselves. But here is my favourite part of this whole story, the part I think about most because it happened almost by accident, tucked inside the very same project. While mining through bone fragments from a remote cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia called Denisova, researchers came across something so small and so unremarkable it barely looked worth testing at all. A fragment of a single pinky finger bone likely belonging to a young girl. It was too small, too plain, too lacking in any distinguishing shape to tell anyone anything on its own. Under a microscope, a bone like that could have belonged to almost any young hominin who ever lived in that cave. So almost as an afterthought, the team ran it through the same genetic process they had been refining for the Neanderthal project. What came back did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals either. It matched nothing in the entire existing genetic record. For the first time in the history of paleoanthropology, an entirely new branch of the human family, later named the Denisovans, was identified not by the shape of a skull or the curve of a jaw or any of the traditional tools scientists had relied on for over a century, but purely and exclusively by its genetic code. A single girl's pinky bone, easily small enough to lose inside a coat pocket, rewrote the shape of the human family tree. Later work would show that this newly discovered group had done a version of the exact same quiet mixing we've been tracing all night, just in a different direction entirely. Traces of Denisovan ancestry today show up most strongly not in Europe, but in places like Papua New Guinea and parts of island Southeast Asia, where some populations carry several times more Denisovan ancestry than most Europeans carry from Neanderthals, which means our species walking out of Africa in slow scattered waves was not just brushing shoulders with one other kind of human along the way. It was brushing shoulders with at least two on completely different continents, and in both cases quietly carrying a piece of them forward without knowing it for tens of thousands of years. Here is a question worth asking yourself while we sit with that. How many other small, unremarkable bones are sitting in drawers in museums around the world, right now mislabeled, overlooked, or simply never tested quietly, waiting to tell us something we do not yet know we are missing? In 2022, more than 3.5 decades after that midnight experiment with a piece of supermarket liver, Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize for these discoveries, recognized for founding essentially by himself, and against the skepticism of most of his own field, an entire new branch of science now called paleogenomics. It is a strange, almost poetic shape for a life to take. A young man is publicly, though quietly, wrong about something that mattered a great deal to him. Instead of walking away from the embarrassment, he spends the next 4 decades of his life turning the exact reason he was wrong into the most powerful tool his field has ever had. I think about that shape more than I probably should. Most of us, when we get something wrong in a way that stings, do everything we can to stop thinking about it. Peeble built an entire career out of refusing to look away from his own mistake. Would you have done the same? Or would the embarrassment have quietly pushed you toward a safer, more conventional question instead? And once that tool finally existed, once an actual readable Neanderthal genome sat on a hard drive in Leipzig, for the first time in history, the obvious next step was almost unbearably tempting. Lay it directly beside the genetic code of a living person, any living person, and simply look at what lines up. What Peeble's team found when they finally did exactly that turned out to be stranger, messier, and far more personal than almost anyone on that research team was prepared for, because it meant every single one of us carrying that ancient inheritance was about to have to reckon with a number, a real specific number, describing exactly how much of a Neanderthal we're each quietly walking around with. That number, once researchers actually sat down and calculated, it turned out to be somewhere between 1 and 4%. If you have ancestry tracing outside Africa, somewhere between 1 and 4% of your entire genetic code right now tonight, while you are lying there listening to my voice, came directly from a Neanderthal. Not a distant cousin 20 times removed. Not a symbolic connection stretched thin over 100,000 years. An actual physical piece of somebody else's body folded into yours, still doing its work. Sit with that for a moment before we go any further, because I think most people hear a number like that, and their brain quietly rounds it down to nothing. 1%, 4%, it sounds small, almost forgettable, the kind of statistic you nod at and move past. But this is not some vague symbolic inheritance, a poetic way of saying we're all connected if you squint hard enough. This is specific physical, measurable genetic code sitting inside your cells at this exact moment, doing an actual job, quietly influencing things about your body you've never once thought to question. Here is where the story gets more personal than most people expect, though, because that 1 to 4% is not the same 1 to 4% for everyone. If you and I both carry Neanderthal ancestry, there is no guarantee we are carrying the same pieces of it. Picture an enormous deck of cards shuffled once tens of thousands of years ago and then dealt out in small uneven hands to every single person who has ever been born outside Africa since. You got dealt your hand, I got dealt mine. Your mother's hand looked slightly different from your father's, and yours is some unpredictable shuffle of the two of theirs, trimmed further by whichever cards happened to get passed down and which quietly got dropped along the way. Unless we happen to be identical twins, the odds that our hands match are close to nothing. Somewhere in the genetic code sitting inside a stranger sitting near you tonight in whatever room you're in, there is very possibly a small fragment of ancient inheritance that you yourself do not carry at all, and vice versa. Even brothers and sisters raised in the exact same house, by the exact same parents, can end up carrying meaningfully different hands of this particular deck, which raises an interesting question, one worth turning over for a second. If two people can both be technically 1% Neanderthal but carry almost none of the exact same fragments, what does that number even really mean? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on which pieces you happen to have inherited, because not all Neanderthal fragments do the same thing, a detail we're going to spend a great deal of time unpacking later tonight. Now, here is a statistic that truly surprised the researchers who first worked it out, and it might surprise you too. Population geneticists at the University of Washington ran the numbers and concluded that this entire sprawling worldwide inheritance billions of people alive today carrying fragments of an extinct species inside their bodies could plausibly trace back to as few as roughly 300 actual mating events between Neanderthals and early modern humans spread out across tens of thousands of years. 300, not 300,000. 300 individual moments scattered across an entire continent and an almost unimaginable stretch of time, each one setting off its own small, quiet chain reaction that is still rippling outward today through you, through me, through nearly everyone we have ever met whose ancestry traces outside Africa. Think about how small that number actually is compared to what grew out of it. 300 moments out of what must have been thousands of years of ordinary, forgettable human life, of hunting and cooking and raising children, and simply getting through one more winter, ended up seeding a genetic legacy, now carried by roughly 6 billion people alive on Earth today, in nearly every country you could name, speaking languages that would have sounded like pure noise to either group standing in that valley. It is a little like discovering that an entire forest traces back to a small handful of seeds carried by pure chance landing in exactly the right patch of soil at exactly the right moment. Most of what those two peoples did together, most of their actual lives, their conversations, their arguments, their private jokes, if they even had any, is gone completely lost to time with no trace at all. What survived was never the memory. It was only the biology. And here is the detail I think is the most beautiful part of this entire chapter of the story. No single living person carries anywhere close to the full genetic code of a Neanderthal. Each of us only holds a small scattered fragment. But if you could somehow gather up every single non-African person alive on Earth today, and pull together every scrap of Neanderthal ancestry scattered across all of us collectively, the researchers who ran this calculation found that we are together still holding on to at least 1/5 of the entire Neanderthal genome. Some more recent estimates built on more sophisticated modelling suggest the true surviving fraction could be closer to 40%. Neanderthals as a distinct breathing walking population disappeared roughly 40,000 years ago, but almost half of what made them genetically who they were may still exist right now tonight, broken into billions of tiny pieces, scattered across the bodies of people who have never once thought about them. I keep coming back to that image because I think it changes something about how you picture extinction itself. We tend to imagine it as a clean total erasure, a species simply blinking out of existence, gone. But this is something stranger, and I think quietly more moving than that. Not erasure, dispersal. A whole people broken apart into fragments too small to see scattered across an entire species that outlived them, still doing their quiet work inside cells, belonging to people who will never know their names. And this is not some abstract accounting exercise happening only on a spreadsheet somewhere. One of the clearest examples researchers have found sits inside the genes that build keratin, the tough fibrous protein responsible for your skin, your hair, your fingernails. Somewhere around 70% of people with European ancestry, and roughly 2 out of every 3 people with East Asian ancestry, carry at least one Neanderthal version of genes tied directly to keratin production, which means an enormous share of the people you will pass on the street this week are quite literally growing hair and skin right now, using instructions their bodies borrowed from a species that vanished 40,000 years ago. It is such an ordinary, unremarkable thing to think about while you're brushing your hair in the morning. And yet there it is, an inheritance hiding in plain sight on the surface of your own body. Have you ever run your fingers through your own hair and wondered, even for a second, exactly whose instructions your body was actually following? Here is a wrinkle in this story that took scientists completely by surprise, though one that upends the tidy, symmetrical picture I have just described. If Neanderthals mostly lived in Europe and the Middle East, you would reasonably expect people whose ancestry traces back to Europe to carry the most Neanderthal ancestry of anyone alive today, simply on the grounds of geography closer to the source, more time spent in the same neighbourhood as their Neanderthal neighbours. That is not what the data shows, and it is the kind of finding that makes a researcher sit back from their desk and look at the numbers twice. People with East Asian ancestry whose ancestors' journey took them thousands of miles further from anywhere a Neanderthal ever set foot actually carry noticeably more Neanderthal ancestry than people with European ancestry do, somewhere between 8 and 24% more, depending on exactly which populations you compare. For years, this honestly puzzled the researchers studying it, because it directly contradicts the simple intuitive story of proximity equals inheritance. A few competing explanations have been proposed, and honestly I find the scientific disagreement itself fascinating because it shows you how messy real research actually is behind the clean headlines. One idea points to population size, the theory that European populations, for complex historical reasons, grew large enough that natural selection had more raw material to work with, gradually filtering out slightly harmful Neanderthal fragments more efficiently than smaller East Asian populations could manage. Another idea, and the one gaining the most traction recently, points to farmers. Around 10,000 years ago, waves of early agricultural people began spreading out of the Middle East into Europe, carrying with them a genetic profile that, for reasons tied to their own separate ancient history, held less Neanderthal ancestry to begin with. As those farmers mixed with the hunter-gatherers already living across Europe, they diluted the local Neanderthal inheritance a little like adding fresh water to a glass, lowering the concentration without removing it entirely. Researchers studying ancient skeletons directly have actually been able to watch this happen. In the data itself, older European hunter-gatherer remains consistently show more Neanderthal ancestry than the farmers who later arrived and settled among them. East Asia, the theory goes, simply never received a wave of newcomers quite like that, so the original inheritance stayed more concentrated, undiluted by any comparable later arrival. A third possibility, still actively debated, suggests the ancestors of East Asians may have crossed paths with Neanderthal populations a second time on their way east, adding an extra layer to an already complicated inheritance. Nobody has fully closed the book on which explanation is correct, and I actually like that about this story. It would be easy for me to hand you one tidy answer and move on, but that would not be honest. What the researchers agree on is the pattern itself, that ancestry and inheritance rarely move in the simple straight lines we like to imagine, and that a journey stretching thousands of miles further from where an encounter first happened does not necessarily mean the inheritance grew fainter along the way. And here is a myth that quietly stood for nearly a full decade, treated almost as settled fact, until a group of researchers at Princeton finally decided to test it properly. For years, scientists assumed that African populations carried essentially none of this inheritance at all, since Neanderthals are only known to have lived across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Central Asia, never in Africa itself. It made sense on paper. Textbooks repeated it. Documentaries repeated it. It also turned out to be wrong. In 2020, using a new statistical method built specifically to catch signals, older, more sensitive tools had been missing. That same research team found small but real traces of Neanderthal ancestry sitting quietly inside African genomes too, amounting to roughly 0.3% on average, a small number but a real one, and a number that until that study most of the field would have confidently told you should not exist at all. The explanation turned out to be almost elegant in its symmetry, mirroring the very story we spent an entire chapter of tonight tracing. Long after the original encounters we've been describing all night, some descendants of that first wave people already carrying Neanderthal ancestry eventually migrated back into Africa roughly 20,000 years ago, and quietly folded that inheritance into populations that had, until that point, never carried it at all. The tidy line separating an African baseline from an inherited Eurasian one, the line an entire generation of scientists had built careful models around, simply was not as clean as anyone assumed. Remnants of that ancient meeting, it turns out, now live inside every population of living humans that has been properly tested for it without exception. I find something quietly humbling in that. For years, some of the smartest people in this field built their entire understanding of human ancestry on an assumption that felt obvious enough not to double-check, and it took someone finally going back and actually looking instead of trusting what everyone already believed to discover the story was bigger and more tangled than the tidy version anyone had settled on. It makes me wonder how many other quiet assumptions in this field, and every other one, are sitting out there right now waiting for somebody patient enough to finally test them properly instead of simply repeating them. So here is where all of this leaves us tonight. Somewhere between 1 and 40% of an extinct species, depending on how you choose to count it, one person, or all of humanity together, is still quietly alive, scattered across the bodies of billions of people who never asked for it and mostly never think about it. Not evenly. Not randomly either, as it turns out. And that unevenness, the fact that some of us carry noticeably more than others, is not even the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is where exactly inside the genetic code itself all of these fragments happen to sit, and more importantly where they very deliberately do not, because once researchers finally mapped it all out, they found something that looked less like a random scattering of leftover history and much more like a message written in the one language none of us were ever taught to understand on our own. In 2014, a young researcher named Sriram Sankararaman, working out of Harvard, alongside a team led by the geneticist David Reich, decided to actually build that map properly for the very first time. Using genetic information pulled from more than 1,000 living people, he set out to trace letter by letter, chromosome by chromosome, exactly where Neanderthal ancestry still survived inside the human genome, and just as importantly, exactly where it did not. It was slow, exacting work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, sifting through billions of individual genetic letters, looking for a signal buried inside decades of statistical noise. What came back was not the even random scattering you might expect from a chance mixing of two populations. It looked deliberate, almost edited. Picture your entire genetic code laid out as a long winding road stretching across 23 separate highways, one for each pair of chromosomes. In most stretches of that road, Neanderthal ancestry shows up here and there, small patches by the roadside, unremarkable, easy to drive past without noticing. But every so often the road runs through a long, completely empty stretch, sometimes millions of letters wide, where Neanderthal ancestry simply vanishes. Not thin, not rare. Gone the way a radio signal disappears completely once you drive far enough into a stretch of empty desert, rather than simply growing fainter and fainter. Researchers started calling these stretches deserts, and once they started mapping them properly, a strange pattern began to emerge. These deserts were not scattered randomly across the map, the way you would expect if the vanishing was simply a matter of ordinary genetic drift, random chance quietly erasing things here and there over tens of thousands of years. They kept landing again and again on the exact same kinds of genes, as though something had gone looking for them specifically. Let me tell you about one family in London that, without ever knowing it, helped hand scientists the key to understanding one of the biggest deserts of all. It is a story that has nothing to do with fossils or caves or ancient bones, and everything to do with a handful of ordinary people simply trying to be understood. In the late 1980s, doctors at a hospital in London began studying an extraordinary family referred to in the medical literature simply as the KE family to protect their privacy. Across 3 generations, roughly half of them, about 15 people in total, shared a severe and very specific speech disorder. They struggled to coordinate the small, precise muscle movements needed to form clear words, the kind of movements most of us make thousands of times a day, without ever giving them a second thought. And many of them also had real difficulty with grammar itself. The underlying architecture of language most of us never consciously think about. Simple conversations, ordering food, answering a teacher's question, introducing themselves to a stranger could become truly exhausting. What made the family remarkable to researchers was not just the disorder itself, but the pattern of it. It passed cleanly from parent to child, generation after generation, in a way that pointed unmistakably to a single gene hiding somewhere inside one family's shared inheritance. It took over a decade of painstaking genetic detective work comparing family trees, narrowing down suspect regions of the genome one careful step at a time, but in 2001 researchers finally found it a single gene on chromosome 7, now known as FOXP2. A single tiny mutation in that one gene was enough to disrupt something as complex and distinctly human as spoken language. It was the first gene ever directly linked to human speech, and it earned a nickname almost immediately in the press. The language gene, a label, most geneticists will tell you is a little too tidy for how biology actually works, since dozens of other genes also play a role, but one that stuck anyway because it captured something true about how significant this discovery was. Here is where the story folds back into everything we've been discussing tonight. When researchers went looking for Neanderthal ancestry across the human genome, that exact stretch of chromosome 7, the neighbourhood FOXP2 calls home, turned out to sit inside one of the largest, most consistent deserts found anywhere in the entire genome. Across study after study using different methods, different research teams, different statistical approaches, that same region kept coming back, essentially empty of Neanderthal ancestry. And it was not alone. Nearby genes with names like ROBO1 and ROBO2, both quietly essential for wiring the developing brain correctly, for guiding nerve fibers to grow toward exactly the right destination during early development, sat inside deserts of their own. Now I want to be careful here because it would be easy to turn this into a much bigger claim than the evidence actually supports, the kind of tidy headline that sounds exciting but oversimplifies real ongoing scientific debate. Nobody is claiming Neanderthals could not speak, and researchers are still honestly divided over how much weight to put on any single desert. But the pattern itself is hard to ignore. The regions of our genome most closely tied to language and to the fine architecture of the developing brain are precisely the regions where Neanderthal genetic material appears to have been the least welcome, systematically repeatedly filtered back out, generation after generation, until almost none of it remained. Something about combining those particular instructions, whatever it actually was at the molecular level, seems to have carried enough of a cost that natural selection quietly, patiently edited it back out. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you could see a map of your own genetic code glowing softly wherever ancient inheritance survived, and going dark wherever it had been carefully removed, do you think you would recognize the shape of what was left as distinctly, unmistakably human? I like to imagine it would look a little like a photograph developing in a dark room, an image slowly resolving out of chemical fog. Certain areas deliberately left untouched by the light, others allowed to darken fully, until eventually, after enough time and enough exposure, a clear picture emerges of exactly what could survive the crossing between two different kinds of people and what could not. Because deserts, as it turns out, are only half the map. Right alongside these empty stretches sit regions doing the exact opposite, holding on to Neanderthal ancestry far more tightly than pure chance would predict, almost as if something had actively fought to keep them in place rather than simply letting them drift away with time. The clearest example lives inside your immune system. Long before modern humans ever set foot in Europe, Neanderthals had already spent something like 200,000 years there, quietly building up defenses against every local infection, every regional parasite, every strain of illness particular to that part of the world. When newly arrived modern humans, freshly out of Africa with immune systems tuned to an entirely different set of threats, began interbreeding with them, something remarkably practical happened. Certain Neanderthal immune genes did not just survive, they spread rapidly through the incoming population because the people who happened to inherit them were measurably better equipped to survive whatever was circulating in their new environment. A cluster of genes on chromosome 4 responsible for detecting bacteria, fungi, and parasites at the earliest possible stage of infection shows some of the strongest, most consistent Neanderthal ancestry found anywhere in the human genome present, at frequencies far too high to have survived by pure chance alone. Researchers studying this pattern have described it almost like a poison, and its antidote arriving in the same package. Neanderthals may well have exposed early modern humans to unfamiliar illnesses through simple close contact, but in that same encounter, modern humans also picked up exactly the genetic tools needed to fight those illnesses off. And a whole family of genes controlling something called tissue compatibility, essentially your body's system for recognizing friend from foe at a cellular level, ended up so thoroughly reshaped by this ancient borrowing that more than half of the relevant genetic variants carried by people across Europe and Asia today can be traced directly back to Neanderthals or to their cousins the Denisovans. Think about that for a second. It is one thing to imagine a Neanderthal handing down a slightly larger nose or thicker hair, some passive physical trait carried along for the ride, easy to picture, easy to accept. It is another thing entirely to realize that a meaningful portion of your own immune system, the invisible army standing between you and infection right now while you lie there listening, was quite literally recruited from an entirely different species, because it turned out to work better than what our own ancestors had brought with them out of Africa. Somewhere in your own bloodstream tonight, cells built from borrowed blueprints are quietly standing guard, doing a job first perfected by people who have not existed for 40,000 years. And this was not some strange one-off fluke. The same pattern adaptive borrowing rather than random accident shows up again in an entirely different part of the world, involving an entirely different group of ancient relatives. High on the Tibetan plateau at elevations where the air holds barely 60% of the oxygen found at sea level, most human bodies respond to the thin air by producing more red blood cells, thickening the blood, in a desperate attempt to carry enough oxygen to keep every organ properly supplied. Over time, that response causes serious problems of its own, dangerously high blood pressure, an increased risk of stroke complications during pregnancy that can be fatal for mother and child alike, the same complications that make it truly difficult for most outsiders to settle permanently at extreme altitude for generation after generation. Tibetans remarkably do not experience this the same way. Their bodies have a naturally blunted version of that stress response, letting them live, work, and raise families at elevations that would leave most visitors gasping for breath within minutes of stepping off a plane. For years, this was simply filed away as an interesting quirk of human adaptation, the sort of regional curiosity mentioned briefly in a textbook footnote. Then researchers traced the specific gene responsible, a gene called EPAS1, back through the genetic record and found something nobody expected. The particular version of that gene carried by Tibetans today matches almost exactly with the genome of a Denisovan, the same mysterious group of ancient humans we met earlier tonight, through a single girl's pinky bone in that Siberian cave. At some point tens of thousands of years ago, ancestors of modern Tibetans acquired this exact genetic advantage from an encounter with Denisovans likely somewhere in Asia, and carried it forward generation after generation into one of the most physically demanding environments on the entire planet. I find something quietly remarkable in placing these two stories side by side. In Europe, an encounter with Neanderthal left behind sharper immune defences. In Asia, an entirely separate encounter with an entirely different branch of ancient humanity left behind the ability to breathe easily at an altitude that would leave most of us gasping within minutes. Different species, different continents, different problems entirely, and yet the same underlying strategy, borrowing a hard-won solution from someone who had already spent tens of thousands of years working it out. The hard way appears again and again across the human story, almost as if interbreeding with our ancient cousins turned out to be one of the fastest shortcuts evolution had available to it. So here is the picture that starts to emerge once you look at deserts and fertile zones together side by side rather than in isolation. This was never a chaotic random mixing that simply faded evenly over time. It was something closer to careful patient editing stretched out across hundreds of generations, keeping what worked quietly, discarding what did not region by region, gene by gene, without any of the people actually living through it ever once being aware it was happening. Natural selection. It turns out reads genetic code the way a careful editor reads a manuscript line by line, deciding what earns a place in the final draft and what quietly gets cut. Nobody sat down with a red pen and made these decisions consciously. It happened the way all natural selection happens, through the blunt patient arithmetic of who survived long enough to have children, and whose children in turn survived to have children of their own, repeated so many times over so many thousands of years that the pattern became indistinguishable from intention. But there is one region of that manuscript that stands apart from everything else we've looked at so far tonight, a stretch of the human genome so thoroughly emptied of Neanderthal ancestry that it makes even the FXP2 desert look modest by comparison. It sits on a chromosome most of us only ever think about in the context of one single, very different question: whether a baby will be born a boy or a girl. Scientists have known about this particular desert for over a decade now, and it remains even today one of the single most argued over patches of empty space in the entire human genome. The subject of dueling papers, competing theories, and at least one major reversal that upended nearly everything researchers thought they understood about it. And the story of exactly why that particular chromosome turned out to be so inhospitable to Neanderthal inheritance is without question the strangest and most contested mystery in this entire investigation. That chromosome is the X chromosome, and before we can talk about why it turned out to be so strange, we need to talk for a moment about what makes it different from every other piece of your genetic code in the first place. I promise this will only take a minute, and I promise it is worth understanding properly, because almost everything truly surprising about tonight's story hinges on this one small, easy-to-overlook detail of basic human biology. Here is the basic shape of it, as simply as I can put it. Almost every chromosome in your body comes in a matched pair, one copy from your mother, one from your father, working as a kind of backup system for each other. If one copy carries a flawed instruction, there is usually a second healthy copy sitting right beside it, quietly covering for the mistake. The X chromosome does not always get that luxury. Women carry two copies just like almost everything else in the genome. Men carry exactly one paired instead with a much smaller, mostly unrelated chromosome called the Y, which means that for men there is no backup copy waiting in the wings. Whatever is written on that single X chromosome, good or bad, gets used immediately with nowhere to hide. You have almost certainly seen the real-world consequences of this without ever connecting it to what we're talking about tonight. Red-green colour blindness is carried on the X chromosome, and it shows up in roughly 8 out of every 100 men compared to somewhere around 1 out of every 200 women. It is not that women are somehow protected from the underlying mutation. Plenty of them carry it. It is simply that sitting on their second X chromosome, a healthy backup copy, is usually there to quietly cover for it, the way it has covered for countless other small errors scattered throughout human history. Men do not get that same safety net. One flawed copy, and the trait shows up immediately out in the open. History gives us an even more dramatic example of this exact same principle, one that quietly reshaped the royal families of an entire continent. Queen Victoria, almost certainly through a spontaneous mutation, nobody could have predicted, carried a flawed copy of a gene on her X chromosome responsible for blood clotting, the condition we now call haemophilia. She herself was never at risk protected by her second healthy X chromosome, but she passed that single flawed copy onto several of her children, and because her daughters went on to marry into royal houses across Germany, Spain and Russia, the mutation quietly travelled with them, carried invisibly by generations of princesses who never showed a single symptom themselves. It only fully revealed itself in their sons, most famously in the young heir to the Russian throne, a boy named Alexei, whose fragile health entirely explained by this same simple quirk of X chromosome inheritance would go on to shape the final, tragic years of the Russian monarchy itself. Here's a strange little detail I think about often, because it involves something you've probably seen without ever knowing the science behind it. Have you ever noticed that calico cats, the ones with those patchy black and orange coats, are almost always female? That is not a coincidence, and it is not really about cats at all. It is about the X chromosome. The genes controlling orange and black fur in cats sit on that same chromosome, and because females carry 2 X chromosomes, one inherited from each parent, they can carry the instructions for both colours at once. Early in development, every single cell in a female body randomly shuts down one of its 2 X chromosomes permanently, and every cell descended from it inherits that same decision. The result scattered across a cat's body is a beautiful patchwork of orange patches and black patches, an entire coat quietly recording cell by cell which chromosome happened to win a coin flip decided months before the kitten was even born. Male cats with only one X chromosome to work from essentially never managed this particular trick. A British geneticist named Mary Lyon worked this whole mechanism out in 1961 studying mottled fur patterns in laboratory mice, rather than house cats at a time when nobody could yet look directly at a strand of genetic code and simply decode it. She had to reason her way to the answer almost entirely from indirect evidence patterns of inheritance, patches of colour, careful breeding records, and a strange dark structure scientists had noticed years earlier tucked inside female cells but had never quite understood. Her explanation turned out to be correct in every detail that mattered, and it held up so well that scientists still refer to the phenomenon today as lionization, in her honour a rare case of a hypothesis proposed almost entirely through careful logic, managing to survive fully intact once the technology finally existed to check it directly. It turns out women are walking around as genetic mosaics, every one of them built from 2 slightly different populations of cells, quietly negotiating tissue by tissue which version of their own X chromosome gets to speak. Something you carry with you every single day, Invisible, permanent, decided before you were even born. I bring all of that up because it tells you something essential about why this particular chromosome behaves so differently from the rest of your genetic code. It is louder, more consequential, more exposed. A harmful mutation hiding on chromosome 11 or chromosome 16 can often sit there quietly for generations masked by a healthy backup copy, causing no visible harm at all. A harmful mutation on the X chromosome in a man has nowhere to hide. It is simply there doing whatever it does for better or worse out in the open from day one. So keep all of that in mind, and now let's go back to the actual data, because this is where things get truly strange. When Shriram Sankararaman's team mapped out Neanderthal ancestry across the entire human genome back in 2014, they found that ordinary chromosomes carried noticeably reduced amounts here and there, the deserts we spent so much time on a little earlier tonight. But the X chromosome was not just a little emptier. It was roughly 5 times emptier than the average autosome, depending on exactly which population you look at, sometimes retaining barely a 1/6 or a 1/5 of the Neanderthal ancestry you would expect to find there if this chromosome had simply been treated like all the others. Later teams working with entirely different statistical methods and entirely different sets of living people kept landing on remarkably similar numbers, which is exactly the kind of stubborn, repeated agreement that makes scientists sit up and take a pattern seriously, rather than dismissing it as noise. And it was not just a little emptier in one small stretch either. Some of the single largest deserts found anywhere in the entire human genome, vast unbroken stretches with almost no trace of Neanderthal inheritance at all, sit specifically on this one chromosome. Let that sink in for a second. Out of 23 pairs of chromosomes carrying the entire blueprint of a human being, one single chromosome absorbed a disproportionate share of whatever process was quietly filtering Neanderthal ancestry back out of the human genome. Not evenly distributed bad luck. A specific, repeated, almost stubborn pattern showing up again and again across different research teams, different statistical methods, different populations sampled on opposite sides of the planet. And here is the detail that turned this from an interesting statistical curiosity into one of the most talked about mysteries in modern human genetics. When researchers went looking for exactly which genes were driving this pattern, they noticed something odd sitting right alongside it. Genes most active specifically in male reproductive tissue, the genes responsible for producing and maturing sperm, showed the exact same kind of dramatic depletion, regardless of which chromosome they happened to sit on. It did not matter whether a fertility-related gene happened to live on the X chromosome or on an ordinary autosome elsewhere in the genome entirely. If its main job involved male reproduction, Neanderthal ancestry around it was thin, sometimes vanishingly so far thinner than you would expect from any of the other genes sitting nearby on the exact same stretch of chromosome. Whatever force had been quietly editing Neanderthal ancestry out of the human genome seemed to have 2 particular targets in its sights: the X chromosome as a whole, and this specific category of genes tied directly to male fertility wherever in the genome they happened to be hiding. 2 very different categories of genetic material showing up together again and again in study after study across research teams who had never coordinated with each other and were often actively trying to disprove each other's earlier work. Can you feel how strange that combination actually is once you sit with it for a second? It would be one thing if the X chromosome alone looked emptier, or if fertility genes alone looked emptier scattered wherever they happened to land in the genome. But finding both patterns tangled together reinforcing each other hints at something deeper than random chance quietly nibbling away at the edges of the genome over tens of thousands of years. It hints at a mechanism. Something specific happened between these 2 groups of ancient people, something connected very directly to reproduction itself, and its fingerprints are still sitting there, plainly visible inside the bodies of billions of people who have never once thought to look for them. I find myself returning to this particular clue more than almost any other piece of tonight's story, because unlike so much of what we have covered so far, this one does not feel like a passive accident of history. It feels like a scar, still faintly visible from something that actually happened. There is actually a name evolutionary biologists give to this general phenomenon, this tendency for the X chromosome to behave differently, more dramatically, than the rest of the genome whenever two closely related populations meet and mix. They call it somewhat plainly the large X effect, and it shows up again and again across the animal kingdom in creatures that have nothing whatsoever to do with humans, or Neanderthals in fruit flies bred together in laboratory jars in songbirds, whose ranges happen to overlap at the edge of a forest in fish, separated by a few thousand years and a mountain range. Because a single flawed copy on the X chromosome cannot hide behind a second healthy backup in males the way it can everywhere else in the genome, any harmful incompatibility that happens to land there gets exposed to natural selection immediately in the very first generation, rather than sitting hidden and harmless for years the way it might on any other chromosome, which means, evolutionarily speaking, the X chromosome tends to act like the most sensitive nerve ending in the entire genome. The first place any real incompatibility between two populations is likely to show itself, and the last place such an incompatibility gets to quietly survive. Now here is where I have to be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve better than a tidy oversimplified answer to a question this deeply complicated. For more than 20 years, the leading explanation for exactly this pattern, the X chromosome desert paired with the fertility gene desert, was treated as close to settled fact by a huge portion of the scientific community. It rested on a principle discovered almost exactly 1 century ago, tested and confirmed across an enormous range of animals entirely unrelated to humans, from horses to fruit flies to songbirds. And for a long time it seemed to explain cleanly and elegantly exactly why this one chromosome turned out to be so inhospitable to an entire species' worth of genetic inheritance. Except, as you're about to hear, that tidy explanation did not survive contact with newer evidence nearly as well as most scientists in this field expected it to. What started as one of the cleanest, most satisfying answers in this entire investigation slowly turned into one of its most contested battlegrounds argued over in academic journals for the better part of a decade, revisited, challenged, defended, and eventually quite recently shaken to its foundations by a discovery nobody saw coming. I have to admit, when I first came across how this part of the story actually unfolded, it honestly changed how I think about scientific certainty itself, how easily a well-supported, widely accepted explanation can turn out to be only half the picture, waiting patiently for someone stubborn enough to ask one more uncomfortable question. To understand how something that seemed so settled could come apart so completely, we first need to go back exactly 1 century, to a British scientist poring over other people's breeding records on animals as different as guinea pigs and lice, long before anyone had ever heard the word Neanderthal used the way we use it tonight, and a strange stubborn pattern he noticed there that would eventually connect his own quiet desk work to a chromosome sitting inside your own body right now. His name was John Burden Sanderson Haldane, though almost everyone in his field simply called him JBS, and he was not strictly speaking running experiments of his own in some quiet laboratory full of mice. He was something closer to a detective working entirely from other people's case files, the kind of restless, wide-ranging mind that seemed constitutionally incapable of staying inside one narrow specialty. Over the course of his career, he would go on to make real contributions to statistics, physiology, and even the origins of life on Earth itself, the sort of scientist people describe only half joking as having been born about a century too curious for his own good. In 1922, working out of Cambridge, Haldane sat down and gathered every scrap of hybrid breeding data he could get his hands on, results scattered across decades of scientific journals, produced by dozens of different researchers working on completely unrelated animals, guinea pigs, lice, water fleas, moths, and quietly began looking for a pattern buried underneath all of it. He found one. And once you hear it stated plainly, it sounds almost too simple to be one of the most enduring rules in evolutionary biology. When two closely related animal species produce hybrid offspring and something goes wrong, sterility, rarity, or the offspring failing to survive at all, it is almost never scattered evenly between males and females. It targets one sex specifically, and it is almost always the same one, the sex carrying two different kinds of sex chromosome rather than two matching ones. In mammals like us, that means males who carry one X and one Y. Haldane called this sex heterozygous, using the vocabulary of his era. Today we would call it heterogametic. Either way, the pattern he described in 1922 on paper, using data about guinea pigs and lice, would end up quietly explaining something about your own body, roughly 40,000 years and one entire extinct species away from anything he was actually looking at. You have almost certainly met a living example of this rule without ever knowing its name. A mule, the offspring of a female horse and a male donkey, is one of the most familiar hybrid animals on Earth, valued for thousands of years by farmers and armies alike for its strength and stubborn endurance, and mules are famous for being unable to reproduce. Horses carry 64 chromosomes. Donkeys carry 62. A mule ends up with 63, an odd number that makes it almost impossible for chromosomes to pair up properly when the body tries to produce sperm or eggs, a little like trying to seat an odd number of dance partners at a wedding, where everyone is supposed to pair off evenly. In the overwhelming majority of cases, this leaves both male and female mules unable to have offspring of their own. But here is the detail that quietly points straight back to Haldane. In the small handful of scientifically documented cases where a mule has ever successfully reproduced, cases rare enough to make actual news headlines whenever a new one turns up on some farm somewhere, every single verified instance, without exception, has involved a female. Not one confirmed case exists anywhere in the historical or scientific record of a fertile male mule. When the door to fertility opens even the tiniest crack in this particular hybrid, it only ever opens on one side. Now, mules are a useful familiar way into this idea, but they were not actually part of Haldane's own evidence. The examples he leaned on most heavily came from something much smaller and far less charming fruit flies, the kind still buzzing around a bowl of fruit left out too long on a kitchen counter, a creature scientists have quietly relied on for over a century, precisely because it breeds so quickly and so predictably that entire generations can be studied in the space of a few weeks. Around the same time Haldane was compiling his survey, a researcher named Alfred Sturtevant, working out of Columbia University, had been carefully crossbreeding two closely related species of fruit fly and recording with obsessive precision exactly what happened to each generation of hybrid offspring, counting individual flies by hand tracking which ones could reproduce and which could not across far more crosses than most of us would have the patience for. Female hybrids came out completely fine, healthy, fertile, indistinguishable in reproductive terms from either parent species. Male hybrids carrying the mismatched X chromosome, inherited from two slightly incompatible lineages, were reliably sterile. Over and over, cross after cross, generation after generation, the same asymmetry kept showing up patient and unglamorous work that would go on to quietly anchor one of the most cited patterns in the entire field. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you had never heard of Haldane and someone simply showed you results like this mule's on a farm, then fruit flies in a laboratory, both pointing toward the same lopsided pattern, would you assume it was a coincidence? Or would you start to suspect there was something structural going on underneath it? Something built into the basic machinery of biology itself, rather than a quirk unique to any one species? Because the truly convincing part of this rule, the part that turned it from an interesting observation into one of the most trusted patterns in evolutionary biology, is not that it shows up in mammals. It is that the exact same asymmetry shows up in animals whose entire sex chromosome system runs in the opposite direction, and the disadvantage flips right along with it, as though nature were running the same experiment twice, just with the label swapped. In several patches of forest scattered across Europe, two closely related species of small woodland bird, the pied flycatcher and the collared flycatcher, occasionally interbreed wherever their territories happen to overlap, drawn together in the brief chaos of a crowded spring breeding season. Researchers who have spent literal decades following individually tagged pairs of these birds, sometimes tracking the exact same family lines across generations, have documented something remarkably consistent. Male hybrids mostly turn out fine. They survive, they find mates though, admittedly with a bit less success than a purebred male, since their slightly mismatched in-between plumage tends to make them a little less attractive to picky females sizing up potential partners each spring. Female hybrids, though, are a different story entirely. They build nests. They lay eggs right on schedule, doing everything a healthy female bird should do, going through every visible motion of a normal breeding season. And those eggs simply never hatch, not occasionally, essentially never. Because in birds, unlike in mammals, it is the female who carries two different sex chromosomes, one called Z and one called W, while males carry two matching Z chromosomes. Flip the chromosome system, and the exact same rule flips the disadvantage onto the exact opposite sex with almost mathematical precision. I find something quietly beautiful in that reversal, honestly. It tells you this was never really about males being somehow biologically fragile or some old-fashioned idea about one sex simply being the weaker one. It is about which sex happens to be carrying the mismatched pair of chromosomes in that particular species, full stop. Swap the chromosome system, and nature swaps the vulnerability right along with it, as reliably as flipping a switch. So why does this keep happening across mules, fruit flies, moths, birds, and dozens of other creatures that share nothing in common, except this one particular detail of their biology? This is where everything we talked about a little earlier tonight about backup copies and hidden mutations comes back into the picture. Remember, a harmful genetic instruction hiding on the X chromosome has nowhere to hide. In a male, no second copy sitting there to quietly cover for it. When two populations that have been evolving apart for hundreds of thousands of years finally interbreed, their genetic instructions do not always fit together as smoothly as you might hope. Small incompatibilities, tiny mismatches between one population's version of a gene and the other's mismatches that might have sat perfectly harmlessly inside either parent species for generation after generation, tend to surface first, and most severely in exactly the sex that has no second copy available to soften the blow. Scientists sometimes describe this using the plain, almost domestic language of dominant and recessive traits, the same vocabulary you might remember from a school lesson on pea plants or eye colour, except here the stakes are considerably higher than the colour of someone's eyes. A recessive incompatibility that a female could carry her entire life without ever noticing a single symptom becomes in a male with only one copy of that chromosome to work from something the body cannot simply shrug off and quietly absorb. Which brings us directly back to that valley and that chromosome and the fertility genes we spent so much time on a little earlier tonight. For more than 2 decades, this was the explanation that made the most sense to almost everyone studying it. Neanderthals and modern humans, having spent something like 600,000 years evolving apart from one another, had likely drifted just far enough that their genetic instructions no longer meshed perfectly, the way 2 closely related dialects can drift far enough apart that a joke told in one no longer quite lands correctly in the other. And according to a rule tested and confirmed across mules, fruit flies and European songbirds, that kind of mismatch should show up first and most severely in exactly the place we found it, the X chromosome, and in exactly the category of genes we found it concentrated around. Male fertility. Hybrid sons, carrying one Neanderthal X chromosome and one set of modern human instructions trying to work alongside it, may simply have struggled to reproduce as successfully as everyone else around them, generation after generation quietly filtering that particular slice of inheritance back out of the human story almost as fast as it went in. Daughters, meanwhile, carrying 2 X chromosomes rather than one, would have had a healthy backup copy sitting right there the whole time, largely shielded from whatever incompatibility their brothers were quietly struggling against, which would neatly explain why the effect concentrated so heavily on that one chromosome, rather than spreading evenly across the entire genome. It is, I have to admit, a remarkably tidy answer, maybe one of the tidiest in this entire investigation. Data from guinea pigs and lice gathered by a British scientist working with nothing but paper and other people's decades-old lab notebooks a full century before anyone had ever sequenced a single strand of Neanderthal genetic code ends up explaining a genetic scar sitting inside the bodies of billions of people alive today, left behind by 2 different kinds of human who had absolutely no idea standing together by that stream, all those tens of thousands of years ago, that their own biology was already quietly working against the odds of that meeting ever leaving much of a mark at all. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that particular detail if you let yourself sit with it. A rule discovered by studying the reproductive struggles of guinea pigs and body lice turns out to hold the key to understanding a love story, if you can even call it that, playing out between 2 different species of humans separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and reunited for one brief complicated moment in a valley neither of them had a name for. For a long time, that was where this particular chapter of the story simply ended. Case closed, more or less, in the minds of most of the people studying it. Textbooks were updated, documentaries repeated the explanation with total confidence, usually in a single tidy sentence, easy to say, easy to nod along with, easy to move past without a second thought. And if you had asked almost any geneticist working in this field, right up until quite recently, why the X chromosome looked the way it did, they would have handed you this exact answer. Tidy, well supported, resting on a full century of confirmed evidence from an enormous range of unrelated species, from mules on a farm to fruit flies in a laboratory jar to songbirds nesting in the forests of Sweden. But there is one more thread in this story we've not pulled on yet, one that was sitting quietly in the human genome the entire time, largely overshadowed by everything we have just covered. It involves 2 other pieces of genetic inheritance entirely, ones that do not simply grow rarer or fainter the way the rest of Neanderthal ancestry does. They disappear completely, without exception, not thinned out over generations, not reduced to a stubborn 5-to-1 ratio the way the X chromosome was, simply gone as though someone had reached in and erased them outright, and nobody has ever found so much as a single trace to suggest otherwise. And the story of exactly how and why that happened turns out to connect this same tidy explanation to a mystery Haldane's own rule was never built to answer. Those 2 pieces of inheritance are the Y chromosome passed exclusively from father to son, and mitochondrial genetic material passed exclusively from mother to every one of her children, though only her daughters get to pass it along again to the next generation. Unlike almost everything else in your body, neither of these gets shuffled and blended the way ordinary chromosomes do, generation after generation mixing a little bit of every ancestor into an increasingly complicated average. A Y chromosome moves down through history essentially untouched, father to son to grandson, a single unbroken thread stretching back further than any family record ever written down. Mitochondrial genetic material does the same thing along the mother's line tucked away, not in the nucleus of your cells at all, but inside tiny structures called mitochondria. The small energy-producing components scientists sometimes half-jokingly call the powerhouse of the cell, structures that carry their own tiny scrap of genetic code inherited only from your mother and her mother before her, in an unbroken maternal chain stretching back tens of thousands of generations, which makes both of them unusually clean, almost embarrassingly simple tools for tracing exactly who came from whom all the way back through tens of thousands of years of ordinary human lives without any of the usual genetic shuffling to muddy the picture. Genealogists and forensic scientists rely on this exact same property today for entirely different reasons, tracing surnames through paternal Y chromosome lines, or identifying human remains through maternal mitochondrial matches. The same basic biological trick nature has been quietly running since long before anyone thought to put it to use. And when researchers finally went looking for a Neanderthal version of either one anywhere in any living person on any continent, they found absolutely nothing. Not a faint trace, not a diluted fragment, nothing at all. Let that sit for a moment, because it is a truly different kind of empty than anything we've talked about so far tonight. The X chromosome, as strange and depleted as it turned out to be, still carries a whisper of Neanderthal ancestry in it, roughly a fifth of what an ordinary chromosome carries thin but real present if you know exactly where to look. The Y chromosome and mitochondrial genetic material carry none. Not thin, zero. Researchers have sequenced thousands upon thousands of genomes from every populated continent on Earth, from small isolated island communities to sprawling modern cities, and the answer has never once changed. Every single person alive today whose ancestry traces outside Africa is without a single documented exception, tracing an unbroken male line and an unbroken female line straight back through modern humans alone, as though the Neanderthal half of that ancient meeting simply never happened, along those two specific threads at all. For a long time, this seemed like the single strongest piece of evidence in the entire case. Here is why. In 2016, a research team at Stanford led by a scientist named Fernando Mendez finally managed to reconstruct and properly analyze a Neanderthal Y chromosome for the first time pulled from a roughly 49,000-year-old male skeleton found in a cave called El Cidrón in northern Spain, a site already well known to researchers for an unusually large cluster of Neanderthal remains recovered there over the years. It was the very last major piece of the Neanderthal genome that had never been directly examined since almost every well-preserved Neanderthal skeleton found up to that point had belonged to a woman, a frustrating gap for a field this far along in its research filled almost by accident, once a usable male specimen finally turned up. What the team found once they finally had that Y chromosome in hand was oddly specific. Several mutations clustered inside a small handful of genes, 3 of which happened to be genes responsible for producing what geneticists call minor histocompatibility, antigens, tiny molecular flags that a body's immune system uses to recognize which cells truly belong to it and which do not. One of those genes in particular, called KDM5D, is already known in modern medicine for something rather specific, and honestly a little unsettling once you sit with it. In certain pregnancies today, a mother's immune system can occasionally react to proteins produced by that exact gene in a male fetus she is carrying, since the fetus carrying a Y chromosome from its father is producing something her own body does not naturally make and has never learned to recognize as safe. In most cases, this passes without incident, quietly resolved by the extraordinary tolerance a pregnant body ordinarily shows toward a fetus that is genetically speaking half foreign tissue growing inside it. But in rare instances that immune reaction has been linked to an elevated risk of miscarriage, the body mistaking a small unfamiliar molecular signal for a threat that needs to be dealt with. Can you see where this is heading? The Stanford researchers proposed carefully and with appropriate scientific caution that a Neanderthal version of that same gene might have looked different enough from the modern human version to trigger exactly this kind of immune reaction over and over, generation after generation, inside modern human mothers carrying a Neanderthal father's sons. If that happened even occasionally, it would not have needed to happen every single time to explain what we see today. It would only have needed to happen often enough, repeated across thousands of years and countless individual pregnancies, to slowly and quietly scrub every last trace of a Neanderthal Y chromosome out of the human gene pool without a single one ever surviving long enough to be passed down to us. To their credit, the researchers themselves were careful never to overstate this. They described it plainly as a hypothesis worth testing further, not a settled fact, noting that actual laboratory confirmation of the mechanism would take real experimental work they had not yet completed. But in the years that followed, that careful provisional note of caution tended to get quietly dropped, somewhere between the original scientific paper and the version of the story that eventually made it into documentaries, museum placards, and casual conversation. It felt at the time like the final piece the whole X chromosome puzzle had been missing. Not just a general fertility disadvantage sitting somewhere in the genetic background, but a specific, plausible, almost clinical mechanism, immune rejection, acting quietly and repeatedly inside the bodies of the very women having these children, that could account for a complete and total absence rather than just a partial one. It gave the whole theory a human face in a strange way, turning an abstract statistical pattern into something that would have played out inside actual bodies, actual pregnancies, actual grief. Nobody at the time could have possibly understood the cause of. Here's a question worth turning over in your mind for a second. If your own body had been unknowingly working against a pregnancy generation after generation, for reasons no one involved could possibly have understood at the time, do you think anyone would have ever noticed, or would it have simply looked to them like ordinary bad luck? The kind of quiet, unexplained loss that got absorbed into everyday life without anyone thinking to ask why? But the mitochondrial half of this mystery turned out to reach back even further than anyone expected, into territory that had nothing to do with the valley we've spent most of tonight inside. And honestly, once you hear how it unfolded, it makes the Y chromosome story feel almost simple by comparison. When researchers compared Neanderthal mitochondrial genetic material against both modern humans and Denisovans, they ran into something that did not add up, the kind of small, stubborn inconsistency that tends to keep a careful scientist awake at night, rather than the kind that gets quietly filed away and forgotten. Every other piece of evidence, every comparison of ordinary nuclear genetic code showed Neanderthals and Denisovans as close cousins, more closely related to each other than either one is to us exactly what you would expect from the family tree everyone had carefully built up over the preceding decade. But mitochondrial genetic material told a completely different story. Neanderthal mitochondria looked far closer to ours than to a Denisovan's. a contradiction that made no sense at all under that same family tree, as though one small branch had somehow been quietly swapped out for a different one entirely, while the rest of the tree stayed exactly where everyone expected it to be. The explanation researchers eventually landed on, published in 2016, and reinforced by further findings the following year, was almost as strange as the discovery itself. At some point more than 270,000 years ago, quite possibly considerably earlier than that, an early population related to modern humans, likely originating somewhere in Africa, appears to have interbred with Neanderthals in a completely separate encounter, one that happened many hundreds of thousands of years before anyone in that valley we described earlier tonight was even born, long before Homo sapiens, as we would recognize the species today, had even fully taken shape. And whatever Neanderthal mitochondrial lineage had existed up to that point was entirely replaced by the version carried in from this earlier encounter, so thoroughly and so completely that every single Neanderthal fossil tested since then, hundreds of thousands of years after the fact, still carries the imprint of that ancient, otherwise forgotten meeting, a quiet echo of a relationship nobody alive would ever have any other way of knowing had taken place at all. I find that detail almost dizzying to sit with, honestly. This means the pattern we have been tracing all night, one group's genetic inheritance quietly working its way through the maternal or paternal line of another, and then eventually without a trace disappearing, was not unique to the meeting we opened tonight's story with. It had already happened once before in the opposite direction, hundreds of thousands of years earlier, so long ago that by the time modern humans and Neanderthals met again in that valley, an entire previous chapter of contact between their ancestors had already come and gone and been almost completely forgotten, preserved only as a strange contradictory signal sitting quietly inside a chromosome nobody thought to question until they had no other choice. It makes you wonder how many other such meetings simply never left any signal at all, swallowed up completely by the ordinary churn of hundreds of thousands of years, with nobody left to even notice the contradiction that might have given them away. So here is where the case stood for the better part of 2 decades. A 5-fold depletion on the X chromosome confirmed independently by multiple research teams using entirely different statistical methods. A cluster of fertility genes emptied out wherever they happened to sit in the genome, regardless of which chromosome they called home. A Y chromosome with a plausible, specific, almost clinical reason to have triggered immune rejection in mother after mother after mother, grounded in a mechanism doctors still study in maternity wards today. And underneath all of it, an earlier completely separate example of exactly the same pattern, an entire genetic lineage quietly replaced and erased, playing out in the opposite direction hundreds of thousands of years before any of the rest of this story even began. Different chromosomes, different sexes, different centuries by the tens of thousands, and yet every single thread kept pointing toward the exact same conclusion over and over, from completely independent directions, the way a detective starts to feel less like they are guessing and more like they are simply confirming something. The evidence had already decided for them, each new piece of data arriving less as a surprise and more as a formality. It is without question one of the most thoroughly corroborated conclusions in this entire investigation. It sat largely unchallenged in nearly every serious paper written on the subject, for the better part of 2 decades, cited so often and so confidently that questioning it at all began to feel less like healthy, scientific skepticism and more like simply refusing to accept an answer everyone else had already agreed on. I will admit, reading through how confidently this explanation was repeated year after year, paper after paper, it is easy to understand why almost nobody felt any urgent need to go back and test it again from scratch. which is exactly what makes what happened next so difficult for a lot of very good scientists to sit with, because it did not arrive as some small correction, quietly appended to a well-established idea. It arrived as something closer to a complete reversal, built on a question so obvious in hindsight that almost nobody had thought to ask it directly. For more than 20 years, a question that would end up turning this entire chapter of tonight's story on its head. The question nobody had thought to ask directly for more than 20 years was almost embarrassingly simple once a small team at the University of Pennsylvania finally sat down and asked it out loud. If the reason Neanderthal ancestry vanished from the human X chromosome really was some kind of built-in biological incompatibility, the same story we just spent a good while walking through, together mules and fruit flies and songbirds and all, then that incompatibility should not have cared which direction it ran in. Biology does not usually keep track of which population happens to be telling the story. It should have shown up symmetrically equally strong no matter which side you looked at it from, which meant if the theory were actually correct, Neanderthal genomes themselves ought to show the exact same kind of depletion, a shortage of modern human ancestry sitting on their own X chromosomes, left behind by all those early modern human ancestors who occasionally interbred with them too. Nobody had ever actually checked, not seriously, not with the tools available today. A researcher named Alex Platt, working alongside Kelsey Harris and Sarah Tishkoff, decided to finally test it properly, publishing their results in the journal Science in February of 2026, in what amounts to one of the most recent major twists this entire field has produced. And what they found did not simply fail to confirm the old explanation, it pointed in the completely opposite direction. Neanderthal X chromosomes, it turned out, were not depleted of modern human ancestry at all. They were unusually rich in it, carrying something in the neighbourhood of 62% more modern human genetic material than you would expect if inheritance had simply been running evenly in both directions. If biological incompatibility on the X chromosome were the whole story, this should have been essentially impossible. A wall that keeps Neanderthal genetic material from settling comfortably on a human X chromosome should by definition be just as effective at keeping human genetic material off a Neanderthal one. Instead, the data showed something closer to a one-way street traffic, flowing heavily in one direction and barely at all in the other. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a wall only seems to be blocking traffic in one direction, is it really a wall at all, or is it possibly just a sign that traffic itself was only ever heavy, going one way to begin with? It is the kind of question that sounds almost too simple to matter, right up until you realize an entire field of very smart people had spent 20 years assuming the answer without ever quite stopping to ask it out loud. That is essentially the pivot this new research made, and once you see the mechanism behind it, it is almost aggravatingly simple, the kind of explanation that makes you wonder how an entire field managed to walk past it for 2 decades. Remember how a Y chromosome only ever travels from father to son, and how a daughter always inherits one full X chromosome directly from her father, with nothing diluted or shuffled along the way, no backup copy blended in from anywhere else. Now imagine that most of the meetings happening in that valley and in valleys like it across those tens of thousands of years were not evenly split between the two possible pairings. Imagine they leaned heavily toward one particular arrangement, a Neanderthal father and a modern human mother, simply because that happened to be the more common shape those relationships tended to take for reasons of culture or circumstance or preference we will likely never fully reconstruct from bones alone. Follow what happens next purely as a matter of basic inheritance, no incompatibility required at all. A son born from that pairing gets his single X chromosome entirely from his human mother, not partly, entirely. His father's Y chromosome, yes, but his X carries no Neanderthal ancestry whatsoever, simply because of which parent happens to contribute which chromosome. A daughter born from that same kind of pairing, though, receives one X from her Neanderthal father and one from her human mother, meaning half of her X chromosome material really is Neanderthal in origin. Now multiply that single asymmetry across dozens of generations, spread across a population where sons and daughters both eventually go on to have children of their own, blending back into the wider human population over time. The sons carrying zero Neanderthal ancestry on their X chromosome, and their sons after them and so on down the line, would systematically pull the average Neanderthal ancestry on the human X chromosome downward generation after generation, purely through the ordinary mechanics of inheritance, the same quiet arithmetic playing out over and over invisible to anyone actually living through it. No infertility required, no immune rejection required, just simple patient arithmetic repeated often enough in one direction for long enough. And that same arithmetic run in reverse explains the Neanderthal side of the puzzle too. Daughters from those same Neanderthal father-human-mother pairings, the ones who ended up living among and being counted as part of Neanderthal populations, would have been carrying substantially elevated human ancestry on their own, X chromosomes inherited directly from their human mothers, which is precisely the excess the Pennsylvania team found, sitting there 62% higher than expected once they finally thought to go looking for it on the correct side of the family tree. I have to be honest with you, when I first came across how elegantly this fits together, it truly rearranged something in how I think about this entire story. For 20 years, an enormous body of very careful, very rigorous research had been quietly built on top of an assumption almost nobody had bothered to test from the opposite direction. Not because anyone was being careless, simply because the obvious explanation felt complete enough that checking the mirror image of it never rose to the top of anyone's list. Now, I want to be fair to the researchers who built that earlier explanation, because this is not really a story about anyone being wrong, so much as it is a story about a puzzle turning out to have more than one piece missing at once. The Pennsylvania team themselves were careful to note that mate bias alone does not appear to explain the entire pattern. Even after accounting for this lopsided direction of pairings, a smaller residual depletion still lingers in some of the more functionally important stretches of the X chromosome, exactly the kind of regions where mild natural selection quietly filtering out slightly harmful genetic combinations over thousands of years would still be expected to leave its own faint signature, which means the honest answer, the one that will not fit neatly onto a single line of a textbook, is that both explanations were partly right all along. A strong dominant pattern of which parent came from which population layered underneath a smaller, secondary effect of ordinary selection working quietly in the background. Reality once again turning out to be messier and more interesting than either tidy story on its own, refusing to hand anyone a single clean sentence to repeat with total confidence. I think that is actually the most useful lesson buried inside this whole twist if you are looking for one. Good science rarely gets overturned by someone proving the old answer was simply wrong. More often it gets refined by someone noticing the old answer only ever looked at half of the available evidence and asking patiently what the other half might show. And here is where this twist reaches backward and touches something we sat with only a little while ago tonight, the complete total disappearance of the Neanderthal Y chromosome and Neanderthal mitochondrial genetic material. Because if the main encounter really was skewed this heavily toward Neanderthal fathers and human mothers, that alone would help explain why so little Neanderthal genetic material moved through the paternal line into the modern human population at all, since so many of those fathers were quite simply Neanderthal men whose sons carried a Neanderthal Y chromosome that then had to survive and spread inside a population that was demographically speaking overwhelmingly human. But there is a second, even stranger piece to this part of the puzzle, one that reaches back far earlier than the valley we open tonight's story inside, uncovered by a completely separate team, several years before the Pennsylvania study ever existed. A team led by a researcher named Martin Petter, examining fragments of Y chromosome pulled from Neanderthal remains found in Spain. Russia and Belgium discovered something that startled them almost as much as the Pennsylvania result would years later. The Y chromosome those Neanderthal men were carrying did not closely resemble what you would expect from a true deep Neanderthal lineage at all. Based on everything else known about how Neanderthals and their cousins, the Denisovans, relate to one another, their Y chromosome should have looked distinctly archaic, closer to a Denisovan's than to ours. Instead, it looked far closer to a modern human Y chromosome. Somewhere between 100,000 and 370,000 years ago, long before the meeting, we have spent most of tonight following an earlier population of modern humans, appears to have interbred with Neanderthals in the opposite direction. Entirely. Human fathers, this time Neanderthal mothers. And the resulting Y chromosome swept so completely through the Neanderthal population that it entirely replaced whatever original Y chromosome Neanderthals had carried, before erasing it so thoroughly that not one fragment of the truly original version has ever been found. Which means, by the time our two people met beside that stream tens of thousands of years later, there may not have been a true original Neanderthal Y chromosome left anywhere on Earth to inherit in the first place. The one Neanderthal men were carrying by then already belonged genetically speaking to us. Sit with that for a second, because I think it might be the strangest single detail in this entire investigation. What looked for years like proof of a hybrid son's Y chromosome quietly failing to survive inside the modern human population may actually be a story about something that happened tens of thousands of years earlier, still an older meeting running in the opposite direction, that had already rewritten the Neanderthal family tree long before the encounter we have been picturing all night ever took place. The mystery was never really about why a Neanderthal Y chromosome failed to survive among us. It may be that there was simply no true Neanderthal Y chromosome left anywhere on the planet by the time our story even begins, quietly replaced generations upon generations earlier in a meeting nobody thought to look for until the technology finally existed to notice the seam. It is a strange kind of relief, and a strange kind of vertigo at the same time if you let yourself feel both. Relief because it means we no longer need to imagine generation after generation of quiet, invisible lost women unknowingly losing pregnancies for reasons science had not yet named. Vertigo, because it means the story we've been telling all night about one meeting, one valley, one turning point in human history, was never really just one story at all. It was always at least two layered on top of each other, separated by hundreds of thousands of years each one, leaving its own fingerprints behind for us to eventually imperfectly try to untangle. I keep returning to how humbling all of this is, honestly, both for the researchers who spent 2 decades refining the older explanation, and for the ones who eventually overturned parts of it. Nobody in this story was careless. Nobody was chasing a headline or cutting corners to get published faster. Each layer of explanation was built carefully, tested rigorously, published only after real scrutiny from other scientists whose entire job is to try to poke holes in exactly this kind of claim, and still 20 years later an obvious question nobody had asked was sitting there patiently waiting to quietly rearrange the entire picture. If you ever find yourself feeling embarrassed about changing your mind on something you once felt certain about, I think this whole chapter of the story is a fairly good argument that you are in excellent company, which leaves us somewhere I think is worth pausing on before we move any further into tonight's story. If one of the most carefully researched conclusions in modern human genetics could stand confidently for 2 full decades and still turn out to be missing half the picture, it might be worth asking. What else in the story we've been telling all night still deserves a second, more skeptical look? Because as it happens, some of the most confidently repeated claims about this entire subject, the ones that show up again and again in comment sections, casual conversation, and more than a few documentaries that really should have known better, turn out to be built on exactly the kind of half-finished thinking we just watched fall apart. Let's actually go through a few of them together, because I think you deserve to leave tonight's story knowing the difference between what the evidence actually shows and what simply sounds good in a headline or plays well as a dramatic voiceover line in a documentary trailer. The first one is probably the loudest, and it has been repeated so often in so many documentaries that most people never think to question it at all. The idea that Homo sapiens marched into Europe and violently wiped the Neanderthals out an ancient war between 2 species ending in something close to conquest victors and vanquished the whole thing wrapped up in a tidy narrative arc. It makes for a dramatic story. It is also, as far as the current evidence actually shows, almost certainly not what happened, or at least nowhere near the whole picture. Researchers modelling Neanderthal population numbers have found something quietly devastating in a completely different way. Their populations appear to have already been small, scattered and fragile long before modern humans ever arrived in any real numbers, isolated into little pockets separated by mountains and unforgiving winters. Exactly the kind of setup that makes a population vulnerable to what biologists call inbreeding depression, a slow accumulation of genetic problems that comes from too small a group having too few options for who to have children with. Some recent modelling even suggests Neanderthals may have been at meaningful risk of disappearing on their own, even if modern humans had never shown up in Europe at all, purely through the quiet, unglamorous mathematics of small isolated populations struggling to sustain themselves generation after generation. A study published just this past spring pointed toward a further layer on top of that: climate instability and shifting social structures interacting together differently from region to region, rather than one single dramatic cause sweeping the whole continent at once. When modern humans finally did arrive in larger numbers, they likely did not need to fight for territory that was in a very real sense already emptying out on its own. In places, competition for the same resources probably made an already difficult situation worse, adding one more stress on top of several others already pressing down. And as we have spent this entire night discussing plenty of those final encounters, ended not in conflict but in exactly the opposite quiet, ordinary family life. Children, grandchildren, an entire lineage folded gently into ours rather than erased by it. Here is a question worth turning over for a second. Which version of this story do you think became popular first, the more comfortable myth of an ancient war fought and won, or the far stranger truth that an entire species may have simply run out of room to keep existing, while parts of it were at the very same time quietly becoming us? I have my own suspicion about why the war story spread so much faster and stuck around so much longer. A clean villain is always an easier story to tell around a campfire than a slow, sad, complicated math problem about population size and inbreeding, even when the math problem happens to be the truer one. Here is a second myth, and this one is a personal favourite of mine because it is so specific and so widely repeated and almost entirely wrong. If you have ever heard someone say that redheads owe their hair colour to Neanderthal ancestry, you have heard a wonderfully charming piece of internet folklore that does not actually hold up. Back in 2007, researchers extracted a pigmentation gene called MC1R from 2 Neanderthal skeletons, one found in Italy, one in Spain, and discovered a mutation that would have caused pale skin and reddish hair, very similar to the effect this same gene has in modern redheads today. To make sure they had not simply picked up contamination from someone in the lab, the team checked their result against thousands of modern human samples, including everyone who had physically handled the bones, and found the mutation nowhere else. It was a wonderful discovery. It was also, on closer inspection, a completely different mutation than the one that gives modern humans red hair. Two separate populations evolving in similarly cold, low sunlight parts of the world independently stumbled onto strikingly similar solutions to the same problem without ever sharing the specific genetic instructions that caused it. Scientists call this convergent evolution nature, reaching the same answer twice from two completely different starting points, purely because it happened to be a good answer both times. Now, before you write the whole idea off completely, there is a small honest asterisk worth adding here because the full picture turned out to be more layered than that first headline suggested, and I think the layered version is actually more satisfying than either the myth or the flat debunking on its own. A separate unrelated variant on that very same gene, one connected more broadly to skin tone rather than specifically to red hair, really does appear to have come from Neanderthal ancestry, showing up today in a small percentage of Europeans, somewhere around 5 in 100, a meaningfully larger share of East Asians, closer to 30 in 100, and quite a lot of certain indigenous populations in Taiwan, where it appears in a genuine majority of the group tested. So the popular version of the myth, the fiery-haired Neanderthal secretly living on in modern gingers everywhere, does not hold up. But a quieter, less dramatic cousin of that same claim, involving a completely different corner of the very same gene, turns out to be true after all, which I think is a nice tidy example of something worth remembering for the rest of tonight's story. The internet rarely gets these things entirely wrong. It usually just simplifies the interesting, complicated true version into a slightly wrong, much more shareable one. Here's a third one, and this one is less a myth than an argument scientists themselves still have not fully settled, which makes it a truly interesting kind of mistake to walk through. You will often hear Neanderthals described flatly as a separate species from us, full stop, no room for debate. The label printed confidently in museum placards and textbook captions everywhere. The truth is messier, and honestly, kind of fascinating once you sit with it. One of the oldest working definitions of a species in biology is startlingly simple. Two populations count as separate species if they cannot produce fertile offspring together. By that definition alone, and we have spent an entire night proving it with genetic receipts, Neanderthals and modern humans fail the test rather badly. They interbred repeatedly across tens of thousands of years, and their descendants are still here, still fertile, still having children of their own right now, tonight, in every part of the world outside Africa. Which is exactly why a real ongoing argument exists among paleoanthropologists about whether Neanderthals deserve their own separate species name at all, or whether they were always more accurately a subspecies of our own, close enough to be considered a regional variety of humanity, rather than something wholly apart from it. I do not think this argument has one clean, satisfying answer, and I am suspicious of anyone who tells you it does. Biology is full of blurry edges exactly like this one, categories that work perfectly well for most of the animal kingdom, and then quietly fall apart the moment you look closely enough at any one particular case. Wolves and dogs and coyotes forming a similarly tangled little cluster of their own ligers and growler bears, reminding us the boundary was never as solid as a textbook diagram makes it look. Neanderthals may simply be one of the best examples we have of just how blurry the line between one kind of human and another can actually get a reminder that the categories we use to sort the living world were built by us for our own convenience, and nature never signed up to follow them perfectly. A fourth myth, and this one is thoroughly modern, has nothing to do with old bones at all, and everything to do with a small plastic tube you might have spat into yourself at some point, sealed up, mailed off, and waited weeks to hear back from. If you have ever taken one of those popular consumer genetic tests and received a little report telling you exactly what percentage Neanderthal you are, I want to gently complicate your relationship with that number. The percentage itself is usually built on solid, real science, the same underlying comparison methods we talked about earlier tonight. What tends to get exaggerated is everything wrapped around that number, playful suggestions that your particular percentage explains why you dislike a certain vegetable or struggle to wake up early or have an unusually strong sense of smell, the kind of cheerful, harmless speculation that reads more like a party trick than a peer-reviewed finding. Almost none of that has any solid scientific backing behind it. A slightly higher or lower percentage than your friends mostly reflects which specific ancestors happen to pass down, which specific fragments the genetic lottery ticket we talked about earlier, not some meaningful personal trait worth building an identity around. The honest, less exciting truth is that your Neanderthal percentage is a fascinating window into deep human history. It is not a horoscope. And finally, here is a mistake so deeply baked into how most of us were taught to picture evolution itself that I think it deserves its own moment before we move on. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us picked up the image of a straight line, an ape hunched over on the far left of a chart, gradually straightening up through a series of increasingly upright figures. Neanderthal usually drawn in there somewhere in the middle, until finally on the far right, a modern human strides confidently off the page, chin up, problem solved. It is one of the most reproduced images in the history of science communication, printed on t-shirts, turned into 1,000 different jokes, and it is also, according to almost every actual evolutionary biologist, deeply misleading. Evolution does not move in a straight line towards some pre-decided destination. It branches endlessly, messily in every direction, at once, most branches simply ending along the way, without ever climbing any particular ladder toward us. Neanderthals were never a rough draft of a human being, some in-between step on the way to becoming us. They were a full, complete, separate branch, every bit as evolved for their own particular world, as we are for ours, who happened for one brief and complicated stretch of time to grow close enough to a neighbouring branch to reach across the gap between them. I think the image a tree rather than a ladder matters more than it might seem at first. A ladder implies winners and losers, an unfinished version of something, and a finished one, every rung existing only to be climbed past and left behind. A tree just implies difference, one branch here, another branch there, neither one more correct than the other, simply shaped by whatever world it happened to grow up inside. Once you start picturing it that way, a great deal of tonight's story stops looking like a tale about winners and losers at all, and starts looking like something closer to two branches of the same tree, growing close enough for one brief window in an unimaginably long forest to touch. So here is where all of that leaves us. A war that probably was not really a war, at least not the whole story. A hair colour myth that turned out to be half true in a completely different way than anyone expected. A species label that may never have been entirely accurate in the first place, still argued over by the very people who study it for a living. A home genetic test that tells you something real, wrapped in a great deal that is not. And an entire, deeply familiar picture of evolution itself that turns out to have been drawn slightly wrong from the very beginning in millions of textbooks for well over a century. None of these corrections make tonight's story any less remarkable. If anything, I think they make it more remarkable because the true version, the one built out of careful, patient, repeatedly corrected evidence, always turns out to be stranger and more interesting than whatever tidy version got simplified down for a headline or a t-shirt. And that same careful evidence has one more chapter left to show us, because everything we have talked about tonight is not simply a story about the distant past filed away safely behind glass in a museum somewhere. It is quietly still shaping the inside of your own body right now tonight in ways most people never think to connect back to that valley at all. Let's start with something almost everyone listening to this lived through personally, whether they realize the connection at the time or not. A few years ago, when a new virus swept across the entire planet, doctors noticed something puzzling almost immediately. Two people of similar age, similar health, similar exposure could catch the exact same illness and end up in completely different places. One recovering at home within days barely troubled the other, fighting for breath in a hospital bed sometimes for weeks. Age explained some of it. Underlying health explained more of it. But even accounting for all of that, a stubborn, unexplained gap remained, one that seemed to follow certain families, certain regions of the world more closely than doctors could account for using anything they already understood. In 2020, researchers Hugo Seeberg and Svante Pääbo, the same scientist whose midnight experiments with a piece of supermarket liver opened an entire field of study we spent time with earlier tonight, went looking for a genetic explanation. They found a cluster of genes on chromosome 3 closely tied to a person's risk of developing severe symptoms, requiring hospitalization, sometimes requiring a ventilator just to keep breathing. And when they compared that exact stretch of genetic code against the Neanderthal genome sitting quietly in their own database, left over from years of earlier work, the match was almost exact. The single strongest known genetic risk factor for severe illness from that virus was not some modern mutation freshly arisen to meet a freshly arisen threat. It came from Neanderthals inherited more than 50,000 years ago, carried forward through hundreds of generations, who never once needed it for anything in particular, still quietly sitting inside roughly 1 in 6 Europeans, and as many as half of all people with South Asian ancestry, waiting completely unnoticed until a virus nobody could have predicted finally gave it a reason to matter. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. How strange is it that a decision made in a valley tens of thousands of years ago could still be quietly deciding right now, tonight, whether a stranger you will never meet ends up in a hospital bed? It is not the only modern condition with roots this old. In Mexico and across Latin America, doctors have long noticed unusually high rates of type 2 diabetes, a pattern that puzzled researchers for years, one that could not be fully explained by diet or lifestyle alone before they finally traced part of the explanation to a single gene called SLC16A11, active in the liver involved in how the body processes fat. That particular version of the gene shows up in roughly half of people with Native American ancestry, close to 1 in 5 people with East Asian ancestry, and is almost entirely absent in Europe and Africa, an unusual lopsided pattern for a species that supposedly began in one single place, and should in theory carry its oldest genetic variants everywhere fairly evenly. When researchers finally sequenced a well-preserved Neanderthal genome closely enough to check pulled from a toe bone found in a cave in Siberia, there it was, sitting quietly inside an individual who'd been dead for tens of thousands of years, the exact same version passed down the exact same ancient chain we have been tracing all night. Carrying one copy of it raises the risk of developing diabetes by roughly a quarter. Carrying 2 inherited from both parents raises it by half. And then there is the quieter, less dramatic inheritance, the kind that never makes headlines, but touches an enormous number of ordinary lives without anyone ever tracing it back to its source. A Neanderthal-derived variant on a gene controlling how nerve cells transmit pain signals, appears to make some people meaningfully more sensitive to pain than others, a subtle dial turned slightly differently in certain populations, most noticeably in parts of Latin America, purely because of which ancient fragments happen to survive in which family line. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is quietly living with a slightly lower pain threshold than their neighbour, and neither of them has any idea the difference traces back in part to a decision made in a valley, tens of thousands of years before either of them was born. Even something as small and ordinary as how food tastes to you carries a little of this same inheritance. Genes controlling how bitterly certain vegetables register on your tongue, the reason some people find a simple plate of broccoli or Brussels sprouts nearly unbearable, while others barely notice any bitterness at all, trace some of their variation back through this exact same ancient thread, quietly deciding which foods felt worth eating and which felt worth spitting out long before either species had a word for either action. Have you ever wondered why you and someone sitting right next to you can taste the exact same dish and walk away with two completely different opinions of it? Now you have at least part of an answer. Take a moment and add all of that up. A cluster of genes shaping how your body responds to a virus that did not exist for most of human history. A liver gene quietly raising or lowering someone's lifetime risk of diabetes. A pain threshold a little higher or lower depending purely on inheritance. A tongue that finds the exact same vegetable either mild or unbearable. None of these are dramatic on their own. None of them made the news the way the original discovery of interbreeding did. But together they add up to something worth pausing on, a quiet ongoing reminder that this is not simply a story about who your distant ancestors happened to meet in a valley. It is a story about who you are turning out to be physically, chemically right now because of it. But I want to end tonight with the one discovery out of all of this that I think closes the entire circle we opened together at the very beginning, because I do not think it is an accident that it involves the exact same subject that has quietly run underneath this whole story, from the moment I first mentioned that empty chromosome all the way through mules and fruit flies and songbirds and immune rejection, and a study published just this year, fertility and family, and whether two different kinds of people could truly build a life together. In 2020, the very same research team discovered that almost 1 in 3 women of European ancestry carry a Neanderthal version of a gene controlling the body's progesterone receptor, the molecular switch responsible for maintaining a pregnancy safely through its earliest, most fragile weeks, when so much can quietly go wrong before anyone even realizes a pregnancy has begun. When they studied hundreds of thousands of women carrying this particular inheritance, drawing on health records from more than 450,000 participants, the pattern that emerged was not one of struggle or loss. These women experienced fewer miscarriages, less bleeding during early pregnancy. On average, they went on to have more children and more siblings themselves than women who did not carry it. Molecular analysis eventually explained why. Their cells simply produce more of the receptor itself, meaning their bodies respond more efficiently to the hormone responsible for holding a pregnancy steady in those first precarious weeks. Sit with that for a moment, because after everything we have walked through together tonight, the sterility, the deserts, the 20 years spent assuming an entire chromosome have been quietly working against this ancient inheritance. It turns out one of the clearest, most measurable legacies still living inside us today is not a scar at all. It is closer to a gift sitting inside nearly a third of European women alive right now, making it easier, not harder, for a pregnancy to survive its most fragile early weeks. The same ancient family that some of tonight's earlier chapters worried might have struggled to leave much of a mark on us, at all left behind among so many other things, a small quiet advantage in the one area everyone once assumed had shut its door on them completely. If you had told the researchers chasing Haldane's rule 20 years ago that this particular chapter of the story would end here, I suspect more than a few of them would have been honestly surprised. I keep thinking about that valley we opened this story inside, the woman filling a water skin at a stream, the man who stepped out of the tree line with meat resting on a flat stone between them. Two people with no shared word for anything deciding over the course of one evening not to be afraid of each other. I do not know what happened to either of them after that night. Nobody ever will. We will never know if they had children together, or if it was some other pairing in some other valley decades or centuries later that actually seeded the inheritance now sitting inside you. That specific answer is lost permanently along with almost everything else about their individual lives. But somewhere scattered across nearly every part of your own body right now, in the shape of your immune system, in the colour of skin and hair carried by strangers you will never meet, in a gene quietly protecting a pregnancy somewhere in the world at this exact moment. In a chromosome that spent 20 years being misunderstood before anyone finally thought to ask the right question about it. That evening is still happening. It never actually ended. It just got folded into the ordinary, unremarkable business of being human so thoroughly that almost nobody walking around today has ever thought to trace it back to its source. That, I think, is the real ending of tonight's story. Not that two different kinds of human met once a very long time ago in a place that no longer has the name it once had, but that the meeting never really stopped happening. It is happening right now quietly inside you while you lie there listening to my voice in the dark. Every time your body fights off an infection, every time you notice the exact shade of someone's hair colour, every time a mother somewhere carries a pregnancy safely through its first uncertain weeks, some faint patient echo of that valley is still quietly doing its work, tens of thousands of years later in a world neither of those two people could possibly have imagined. They could not have pictured hospitals or genetic laboratories or a voice like mine reaching you through the dark on a small screen beside your bed. And yet here we both are still shaped in some small and permanent way by whatever passed between them. I think that is what has stayed with me most working through this particular story. Not the science itself, remarkable as it is, but the sheer patience of it. Nobody involved in that first meeting could have known any of this would still matter 40,000 years, and then some later. They were not thinking about chromosomes or hybrid fertility, or immune rejection, or a virus that would not exist for another 58,000 years. They were simply two people, tired, curious, a little afraid, deciding whether to trust each other for the length of one evening beside a stream. Everything else, every desert, every twist, every gene quietly working for or against you tonight, grew out of a decision that's small, made by people who never once imagined anyone would still be talking about it this far into the future. It makes me wonder honestly what quiet, unremarkable decision any of us might make in the years ahead that could end up rippling outward for 40,000 years of our own in ways we will never live to see and could never begin to predict. We like to imagine history as something that happened to other people, safely finished, sealed away behind glass in a museum somewhere. But you're not a visitor standing outside tonight's story looking in through the case. You are the evidence. Every part of you that this valley touched is still here, still working, still quietly deciding things about your body you will never consciously notice. That more than anything else is what I hope you carry with you as you drift off tonight, not a list of facts about an extinct species, but the strange, oddly comforting truth that you're not separate from any of this. You're simply the newest page in a story that has been quietly writing itself, one small decision at a time, for far longer than anyone standing in that valley could have ever imagined. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight and for staying with this story all the way through from that first quiet evening by the stream to everything it turned out to still be doing inside you right now. Stories like this one take a long time to put together, properly digging through decades of research, chasing down the right studies, trying to get the details honest rather than just exciting, and having someone actually listen all the way to the end is not something I take for granted, not even for a second. If tonight's story kept you good company while you drifted off, I hope you will come find me again for the next one. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Quiet, strange, true things hiding in plain sight inside all of us, and I would love nothing more than to tell you the next one soon. Sleep well wherever you are tonight, and I will see you next time.